Chapter 1. The Riddle House. Chapter text. Harry and Lily were the only ones to wake at the normal time the next morning. In fact, they were the only ones awake all day. Both stayed quiet and in the kitchen, chatting about everything and nothing. Harry was particularly interested in asking his mother about her cases she'd had at work, trying to avoid as much talk of school as possible. Though he longed for as much detail of their time at Hogwarts, he now realized he may have gotten all the information he was going to get for a time, as memories of that place would be particularly painful for everyone now. Harry still couldn't help but edge in at one point. So, what did they do about days like this back in school? Lily kept her eyes focused on her infant, trying to ignore the frown line this brought up, but she knew she was the best person to answer, as none of the boys could have gotten this out properly. Remus normally slept through the day hidden in the hospital wing. The other three often went around making jokes that he was just skiving class. They put some numbing charms and the like to hide the worst of their injuries. Harry was frowning in thoughtful concern, trying to picture what he'd seen of them last night, actually pushing through a whole day of classes, and his respect for them grew tenfold. Thankfully, it wasn't a problem today. He couldn't help the next question that burst out. But you said he's never come back looking so bad. Why couldn't they have just gone outside? Why stay in that tiny little room? He'd spent some time outside that morning, looking around what could have possibly been his childhood home. And while he could see something that might have been a town off in the distance, he couldn't help thinking of some way that could have gone better for the lot of them. Lily had honestly asked James the same the other night, unwillingly admitting she hadn't wanted this in the house if it could be avoided. But James had admitted same as she told Harry. They didn't feel it was safe enough. They were wandering Hogwarts and Hogsmeade for years before they even made Animagus. They knew the area and felt safe running around with, well, Moony as they refer to Remus when he's like that. We've only lived here about a year, though, and almost all of that time has been out of the house for one reason or another due to the order and the like. Normally, they go out to some unpopulated forest near Remus' parents' old place, and they didn't have the heart to test anything new last night. Harry could tell how much it was bothering his mum to talk about. He put it all down to moments when he was sure she was remembering the rat making a crack or two that she'd just brushed off at the time, to her old friend, Severus trying to make something more of it, and her ignoring that too, and how now she was the one making defenses for him, while she'd rather never see those two again. Then there were other things, a topic that couldn't be avoided but they both knew would be brought up, at least by Sirius, so Harry voiced the concern now. Are you guys going to try and convince him to come back over again? He knew for a fact he did not want that confrontation to happen, let alone somehow be a part of it when he knew he would somehow step in and protect someone, though he had no ideas of who anymore. Would he still try and protect Pettigrew? He doubted this, as he no longer held the key to Sirius' freedom in this timeline. Would he still be okay with watching his dad and uncles become murderers, though? That he had no answer to. Lily saved him by saying, "No," with absolute force, clearly leaving no room for discussion, even as she explained, "It's too dangerous. Clearly we can't leave here for a reason, at least until these books are done. If nothing's changed and we still can't leave after that, then we'll concern ourselves with it. But for now, it's too dangerous. Merlin knows what could have happened if we had convinced that rat to stay and read with us. Something might have gone very wrong adding someone into the group when clearly there's something going on around us. I'll tell Sirius, and anyone else it is not worth the danger." Then she finished in much softer tones. "Besides, he's hardly come around so much lately. It would probably take Merlin himself to get him to come back over." Over a dozen times Lily had to squash down the urge to go and wake her boys, to at least get some food in them while they slept. But instead she only occasionally peeked in on each of them, repeated a few of the healing charms she knew, and left them to sleep the day away. The first thing James found the next morning was Sirius and Harry sitting on the couch, laughing about something. Pressing down on the vile green urge that was trying to come back up, he made to go back up the stairs and pretend like he hadn't noticed, trying to give them some space and bonding time he knew Harry would want now, when Harry caught sight of him and said, "Hey, Dad, come here and look at this." Forcing a smile onto his face, he came over and ignored the fact that Sirius was giving him an odd look to glance over, and see what Harry was looking at, and burst into real laughter at finding them holding a photo album he and Lily had been making recently. "What are you doing with this?" he snickered, lunging over the sofa and landing with a whump on Harry's other side, offering his hand out for it. "I wanted to show it to him," Sirius said like that was obvious, now smiling lightly as well when he realized whatever had been bothering James had clearly passed for now. Thought it would be worth a laugh for him. James began flicking back through the pages they'd already passed, stopping at a few and laughing in remembrance of when they'd been taken. There was the one of the first night Harry had been brought home, Lily being so exhausted in the photo she was constantly yawning, but the glowing smile so bright it dimmed the rest of the background. There was the day James brought Hickory home as an anniversary gift for Lily, and the very first thing the cat did was walk up to 2-week-old Harry and curl around him to fall asleep. Harry recognized quite a few from his own Hagrid had gifted him, and couldn't help but wonder if they were in fact the exact same photos. Could this have possibly survived whatever had happened to his parents on that Halloween? Had Remus somehow fallen into possession of this, and he'd been the one to send some of these pictures to Harry? Hagrid had mentioned some of his parents' old school friends had supplied the photos. It made sense at least. He found even more photos from his parents' wedding than the one from his, plus a few others of what were probably his parents first, like them standing in the empty living room when they'd first gotten this house. There were some that were even older, scattered around before Harry was born, of James, Sirius, and Remus all doing random things, such as Sirius' last birthday, and the cake that had exploded onto the ceiling, leaving all of them with icing in their hair. Remus, with a hairbrush where his nose should have been, done in retaliation by Sirius for who knew what at the time. James a week before his wedding acting like a loon and bouncing around every inch of the frame, his constant worries about everything that was going to go wrong long since forgot. The rat was conspicuously lacking, and there were some empty spots where a few pictures had clearly been removed, and James couldn't help but wonder if Lily had spent the day they'd all been resting to pull them out. He supposed that's how Harry and Sirius had come across it. They spent the rest of the morning going over every picture, Harry still able to come up with endless questions for the both of them about every second the pictures were reenacting, until finally Remus and Lily arrived as well. Sadly, they ran out of pictures about that same time. Remus had the baby playing happily in his arms and curled up into the recliner with him, leaving Lily to lounge out on the other sofa by herself for now. All three of the boys still looked terrible. James still had a vivid black eye and kept wincing whenever he shifted around too much, and Sirius wasn't twitching as much as he normally did, leaning a little more heavily than was usual into the couch to keep himself upright. Remus still somehow looked the worst, an unnatural white with vivid dark circles under his eyes, and he was moving the least of all, though that's probably why he wanted the baby, to help him remain as still as possible. Silence rung in the room. Harry got the feeling they were trying to avoid talking about something, and he had a very good idea of what. They decided they'd waited long enough anyways, and Lily went to fetch the largest book of the stack stamped with a 4, a worry line already creasing into her as she asked, "Merlin, Harry, what happened this year? It's thick as a tomb." Harry just gave her an exasperated look. She knew he wouldn't be able to answer. At any rate, she wasn't even that worried. Maybe this year would finally be filled with happy and memorable times, with actually more than one chapter in a row where she didn't get sick from stress. As she rummaged for the first page, she at least comforted herself nothing could be as bad as last year. Riddle, Sirius frowned. What an odd way to start. Wasn't that Voldemort's real last name? Pretty sure, yeah, James grumbled. He wasn't likely to forget that chamber any time soon. Lily was already getting a tingling feeling up her spine, asking, "Okay, but so what? Where's little Hangleton, and what's this have to do with Harry?" "Maybe it's like those odd moments in the first book," Remus offered, "and this book's going to show us some things that aren't from Harry's point of view. After all, Harry wasn't likely on vacation anywhere, nor did he see a place like Private Drive's occupants being referred to as villagers. Does it have to start with information about Voldemort, though?" Harry sighed with distaste, completely with his mother on this one, in hoping this wouldn't amount to anything, and already getting an insistent feeling trying to tell him otherwise. "So one of those places where you wonder why it hasn't just been torn down at some point," Sirius muttered with disinterest. He wanted to hear about Harry, not Voldemort's childhood home or some nonsense. He really didn't like this was how Harry's next year was getting started. Great, so no more of his bloodline is hanging around. Good to know, Remus huffed. Lily still couldn't get rid of this nasty little feeling, like she really didn't want to know about what these people gossiped around in relation to anything to do with Voldemort's namesake. But she'd never gotten a say with these books before of what she was reading. Sounds about right of any tale, James agreed, his own time at Hogwarts giving him plenty of experience with how wild a tale could spin, though it also caused a more terrible wince in his memory than any physical injury could do to him at one person who was entangled in every single one of those moments. "Ah," they all muttered, finally feeling a small spike of curiosity. Sure, they didn't really want to know anything about Voldemort except possibly where his self-destruct button was, but they also couldn't help the vaguest of interest starting up at what could have possibly caused this nut job to turn into the way he was. Wow, Sirius couldn't help the curiosity in his voice now. Wonder what did them in. Lily felt he was actually showing too much interest now. It was still gross, but didn't rebuke him either. She couldn't deny her own shared feeling. Why am I not surprised? Remus scoffed. Apparently the whole line was rubbish. Lily still couldn't help but think that was kind of sad. Not one person mourned the passing of an entire family, but they were possibly the parents or in some way connected to Voldemort, so she couldn't muster up much herself either. Oh, wait, James said, ruffling up his brow as he struggled to remember details back from that chamber. Is this Voldemort's dad and grandparents? He did say he was named after his father, unless you just said Voldemort was dead, in which case I am okay with this. I doubt we're that lucky, Sirius sighed dramatically, and it's likely the first. He knew James had been kidding anyways. The timelines didn't match up for this to be the description of the death of the Dark Lord, but it was still nice to think about. But this could be what started Voldemort on being, well, Voldemort. Lily was frowning as she thought this over. Over half a century ago, that's before Voldemort took over. Maybe the death of his family caused him to be the way he is. The way he went on about his own dad being a muggle, Remus reminded. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if he did this himself. Harry only got the briefest flash of something, like he wanted to agree with Remus, before Sirius laughed it off. Gee, thanks, Moony. Sirius shuddered. I really wanted to think about Voldemort doing his own parents in, though, he added on curiously. Guess I can't say I haven't envisioned doing it myself. There was no real enthusiasm to his joke. After the last book, even knowing he hadn't committed all those murders, he just couldn't find the same sense of humor about killing anyone else. He still did it out of obligation. He'd never missed a chance to ridicule and show off how much he hated his namesakes. It was just a shock to the others to hear such a different tone while speaking of it. Though it most likely does seem magical at this point, Lily muttered to herself, as she quite agreed. It would be odd for this to be explained otherwise. Harry felt something twitch inside of him at this name being mentioned, though he had no real connection to it. If it wasn't someone he should care about, then why did he feel sorry for him? Why would he feel anything for a name he was positive he probably had never even met? And that just automatically makes you a murderer now, does it? Remus grumbled. He didn't particularly like going over to strangers' houses either. How would she know that? James demanded. If she's never been over like it's implied, how would anyone but the Riddles know that? It was said he was arrested, Sirius shrugged. Maybe this cook overheard the police saying that while it was happening. Does he have a motive? Lily frowned. Sounds to me like he just wants to be left alone. I can't see why he would go doing this, as I highly doubt this wealthy family would even leave anything to their gardener, plus he'd also be out of a job. Well, let's see if the police scrounge up something, Remus offered. War turns a lot of people funny, James muttered bitterly, thinking that no one should have a right to judge those who hadn't actually been in one. He'd seen what war had done to one of his best friends, changed him into a radically different person, and he didn't appreciate any little reminder. They all sighed heavily, already having lived through one book of a wrongly convicted person. They didn't even know this man, but it wasn't any friendlier of a reminder that it could be happening all over again to some random stranger. Original, Sirius snorted. Maybe not, James muttered, thinking back to Voldemort's more human description, and that wasn't a bad likeness. Oh yes, just that tiny little detail, Remus rolled his eyes, not really able to find it as funny as he once might have. I'm sure if they took a look at Voldemort's face, they would have, Harry sighed, wondering why he'd said that at all. Had Voldemort been the person to kill his own family? He only got a sharp poke from his memories for trying to remember. They all had a bite of distaste in their mouth, beyond displeased at this continued topic, perhaps taking it to personally due to what they'd recently learned would happen to Sirius, but not finding it any less foul happening to someone else. Lily actually looked like she was going to interrupt herself and explain, but James cut her off. Let it go, Lily. They're not here to explain it to, and not even I wanted to ask. Well, that's nice, Remus said, unable to help breaking off at the end uncertainly. He still had no idea what any of this had to do with Harry. What was the point of this book showing all of this, and not even through Harry's point of view? Lily couldn't suppress a happy smile, though. She dearly wanted a garden, and she suddenly found herself very fond of Frank for even in his old age sticking to something that he clearly loved. James made a little scoff. He had no problems with giving cranky elders some fun in their life, but vandalizing was never one thing he did intentionally, making Lily give a heated scowl of outrage, finding these some pretty despicable kids for tormenting this old man's hard work. Sirius couldn't say anything. Could make no claims whatsoever that he wouldn't be right along with those kids. This town sounded boring to him, and seeing how far they could push this guy sounded like the only source of amusement some rowdy boys could get up to, so long as they didn't do anything too crazy like actually burn the place down. I'm pretty sure they'd be at it, no matter what their parents or anyone said, Remus said, with an eye roll. Most boys in the age he was thinking wouldn't listen to Merlin himself if he told them to stop. Harry was getting a very hair-raising feeling, instincts going haywire as he wanted to blurt out a warning to this old man, that he was way off the mark on that one, and he should just go back up to bed. The problem, he knew, was that if he even started to try, he'd receive a very sharp pain for his troubles, and considering how much his family freaked out whenever that happened, he couldn't bring himself to dig into the feeling despite how much he felt he should. Can't honestly blame him, Lily sighed with a deep shake of her head, wanting to give those kids a good telling off for this. Not that she'd admit she probably would have been one of the first to go in that place on a dare. That wasn't so odd, though. Even the two purebloods knew how to jimmy a lark so that it didn't look forced the Muggle way. Or possibly the kids had gone in through one of the broken windows previously mentioned. This all seemed perfectly harmless and meaningless to Harry. That's what all four of them kept telling themselves, and yet they were starting to get a prickling feeling. One glance at Harry and they could see he was struggling, his face clearly showing that he was trying his hardest to repress a memory, and if his rubbing at his temple was any indication by now, they knew it was going to be a bad one. I can see the fun of trying to sneak up on them, Sirius nodded, trying to put some mischief into his voice, trying to force the light-hearted tone he so craved from just one stinking chapter, but it sounded false even to his ears. Remus couldn't help but picture this place like the Shrieking Shack, and the comparison wasn't making him feel any better considering the last time any mention of Harry had been in there. And now he was having to fight back a combination of vile and hatred all over again, and it was in no way reassuring to what was going on now. Lily couldn't help finishing that with a little rasping noise, like she wanted to scream and gasp all at the same time, but the two strangled themselves off because this just couldn't be happening. Not to her son, not again. There was only one person who could be referred to as my lord, and despite how much she so desperately wanted it to not be true, she couldn't come up with any other alternatives. She'd had a bad feeling since the first line of the book with Voldemort's namesake. Now here he was in the house. Where was Harry? That one question just kept flitting across her mind, now with more force than ever before, because she really wanted to hear that this was taking place on a different continent than near her son. She came back to herself to find James with his arm wrapped tight around her. He'd clearly hopped seats and was now muttering reassurances in her ear that at least this was like that beginning of the first book. Harry really wasn't there now around that monster. The shark still hadn't completely worn off when Remus blurted out, "Who's talking to him? Is it like another Quirrell thing? Because otherwise I really don't see how an answer's coming." You just have this magical ability to ask exactly the wrong questions. Sirius scowled at him. He didn't want to be thinking of things like that. He wanted to hear the possibilities of who else it could be. He'd only gotten 1 year of reprieve of fearing a Voldemort come back so far, and that had been the worst one of all for him. Remus didn't look very repentant. His mind was scattering in too many different directions, at once trying to understand this. At least he wasn't asking any more what this had to do with Harry. He had a very nasty feeling why they were learning this in comparison with his cub's life now. No one answered him, though, because no one had any answers. They had no idea how Voldemort even still existed. They weren't even sure why he disappeared the night James and Lily had died. What could have happened to turn him into the vapor-like creature that had been able to share a body with Quirrell? Voldemort no longer resembled anything they could wrap their mind around. So any questions regarding him couldn't even be speculated. He dwelled so far outside the realm of their knowledge. Lily did not look happy about it, but when the silence continued to drag on, she realized she was expected to keep going no matter how much she'd rather do anything else. At least now, she had her husband at her hip for some reassurance that everything was going to be okay. Sirius couldn't help a shudder of disgust. Recognizing this was most likely what Voldemort's voice sounded like now, and getting a creeping chill up his spine at the thought. The old nickname of one of the people she would have claimed as a dear friend up until a few days ago slipped out of her mouth almost without realizing what she'd said. Once she did register that the rest of the boys in the room had tensed up, and she recognized why. She couldn't decide what surprised her more, that he'd really gone back to Voldemort, or that he was even still alive and had escaped the combined might of Sirius, Remus, and Dumbledore. Really, though, it shouldn't have come out as such a surprise. She really should have realized it would lead to this. That rat really didn't have anywhere else to go back but to Voldemort's side, but she hadn't expected it to come up so soon. What she did happen to linger on in confusion is why Voldemort would use that childhood nickname. Clearly, the rat had told Voldemort everything, but why would Voldemort call him that? Had the rat even requested it? It was such an odd detail, she almost didn't take notice of what the others were doing. What Sirius proceeded to call him would have made anyone with the foulest of mouths do a double take, not that anyone in this room could blame him. His rage and anger at being denied his revenge on that treasonous worst excuse for an Order member he'd ever met left him a broiling mess at even the slightest hint of his being mentioned. Now Lily had just said that he was the one catering to Voldemort himself. That putrid little rat was actually helping him, being his right hand, and he couldn't even think straight. He was cursing so much in his mind as well. James had no qualms about agreeing with every word, but it didn't change what he was really feeling, which was hurt. Why couldn't he be hearing about Sirius and Remus hunting this soulless critter down? Why couldn't he go on hearing about Harry having a good time with his friends over the summer? Why was it at every turn of the page he felt something else being ripped from him, and it just kept leaving him emptier the longer this dragged on? Remus still couldn't help but wince in shame at the mere mention of that name. Yes, his family had convinced him that it wasn't entirely his fault, that the little backstabber's actions belonged only to him, but Remus still replayed those night's events over and over, and he still wanted to strangle the life out of himself for being a hand in his escape. He should have been paying for his crimes in Azkaban by now, for what he'd done to Sirius, James, Harry, and Lily, and most likely Remus himself, if given the barest of a chance. Harry recognized hearing this name would still be a terrible blow to everyone in here. It really didn't make him feel much better at the resurfacing reminder that this name was the reason he was interacting with his parents for the first time. This wasn't going to go away, though, not for some time. His gut was confident of that. So though he'd rather not, he managed to catch his mom's eye and silently asked her to keep going, knowing this wasn't something to get better with time, so hoping moving past it for now would still be a better option. Sirius couldn't help it. He heard an unfamiliar female name, and he automatically wanted to make a crack about someone getting a new girlfriend, but he restrained himself by only adding in a few more phrases of malcontent. Milk her. Well, this clearly wasn't a person then. Were these two really dragging a cow around with them in this old abandoned house? As unlikely as that seemed, this one random mental image finally gave the lot of them something funny to focus on, even if it was for the shortest amount of time. "Wish it had just killed you," Sirius muttered, still intermittent with words he never would have dreamed of using if the baby could understand what he was saying. James couldn't help but frown, feeling fidgety all over again, as his favorite sport was mentioned during such a trying time, and he wanted to feel happy just at the mention of it, but also still wanted to curse something into smithereens the longer this conversation dragged on. Ah, the innocent! Remus forced an amused look he didn't really feel. Of that we can agree on, as I doubt you understand anything, Lily snarled under her breath. I don't want to know. I do not want to know, Lily moaned, glaring down at the print and unbelievably wanting this book to be over already even though she just started. It was just so tiring between hearing about Voldemort and the rat, now working together, plotting anything. I keep forgetting the muggles hearing this, Sirius frowned, for the first time his attention drawn elsewhere besides the two speakers and realizing how bad this could get fast. That old man had better start picking his ear all right and get out of there as fast as his bum leg would allow, or they were going to be hearing about something far worse. Well, he's not wrong, Remus sighed, rubbing furiously at his temple to stave away an already growing headache. That part actually wasn't surprising. They were all well aware that of course Voldemort would seek the boy who had been his downfall. It was why they were all so tensed and stressed at the mere mention of Voldemort's name. Of course that didn't make them hate it any less, it just wasn't a shock. What did get to them was that Wormtail had suggested otherwise. Even Sirius, who had every intention of trying to lop off his head with a duller axe than what had been used on nearly headless Nick, registered that this little vermin had actually made an attempt at trying to protect Harry. This in no way excused what he'd done to them by any means, but it was the first glimpse for the first time that maybe their old friend was still somewhere buried in there. Too little too late. Sirius made a guttural noise, his brief flare drowned at once as he began picturing all over again every torture he'd ever heard of, and making up a few on the spot. James, on the other hand, flinched like Lily, had just cracked him over the head with this book, which would probably give him head trauma, but even that would be easier to deal with than what he was feeling now. He kept flashing back and forth between anger and betrayal like a coin toss, never sure which one he was going to get next, but still feeling as raw as the first time. This time it was betrayal, and he wanted that denial back all over again before he'd admit one of his friends had just said that about his baby. Lily was planning on pulling out her own tongue if she really had to say that again, still on the more murderous side, like everyone else at this sniveling coward covering his tail, probably just trying to make his job easier or some nonsense, considering how well protected her son was. But it didn't make the words any easier to say. The thing. James quickly latched onto that, unbelievably finding that whatever Voldemort was up to was actually easier to hear than his friend tossing his son's life away like that. Remus was grinding his teeth together so hard his jaw was starting to ache. The only reason he wasn't being as vocal as Sirius was because of the baby in his arms, and he didn't want to start yelling with him so close. His restraints were starting to wane out, though, as he realized that whatever that rat was suggesting wouldn't be any more beneficial to this random person than to Harry, which was most likely murder or something worse. He still could hardly picture it, that same person who'd been to this house less than a week ago casually speaking to the Dark Lord about these matters. Harry couldn't help but frown in agitation at that, wondering what protections those were, and wondering all the more why he'd never been informed of these. Shouldn't he know if, say, his house was being watched, or some other monitoring was taking place that stopped any old Death Eater like Malfoy from showing up at his door and killing him? He was having a mental argument with himself whether to bring these things up, see if his family could know anything about them, or if he would sound petty griping about being protected from people he knew he did need shielding from. Judging by the slight confusion on the rest of them, Harry decided he'd have to let it go for now. I still can't imagine what made him go get him in the first place, Lily grumbled. Sure, the rat was outed now. Nowhere was safe for him so long as Sirius' name was still criminal number one, but to Voldemort. He could have just lived out the rest of his life as a rat in shame. He could have moved to another country and started a new life. Why was this still his decision? His reasons, or lack thereof in this case, were more than baffling, and not something she wanted to linger on. James looked like he was trying to release all of the air from his body. At once he sighed so loudly, because the reason he wanted to hear for this to be true never would be, and it still wouldn't make up for what he did. Sirius never in his life would have thought he'd have something to agree with Voldemort on, but he still thought that was too mild, so he didn't think it really counted either. Lily couldn't help but reflect back on what she'd been thinking, how the rat had other continents to get to if he really wanted to. He must have some other reason for being there, but she had not an inkling of what, so she still couldn't bring herself to say anything. I still want to know what the bloody hell he even is, Remus grumbled, thinking that if they could just find this weak little thing that was being described, now they could be done with all of their problems. Then he had to correct himself that this hadn't happened yet, thankfully, but they were still dealing with an all-powerful Voldemort, so they'd have to find another weakness of his. Least someone shut him up, Sirius huffed, thinking he'd die happy if he never had to think about that sniveling voice again. Remus scathed under his breath, thinking that was the last trait in the world that Rat could claim, ashamed he'd wound up in Gryffindor all those years ago with the rest of them and caused the rest of them so much. James' leg gave a spastic twitch, an old feeling wanting to rear up when he realized that Peter was being tortured, but that was easily smothered by a terrible glee that he deserved every last second of it and more. Lily gave a little ooh under her breath. It may not have been a name she was familiar with, but that didn't make the legitimate claim that the rat really had already gone out and killed even more no less painful. She was still having problems coming to terms with the fact that he'd killed 12 people and seemed to feel nothing for it. Remus' face went even more sour, though, as he snapped. She didn't deserve that. You know her? Lily asked in surprise. Not well, James shrugged. She was a few years above us, but a horrid little snitch. She made up stories all the time to get people she didn't like in trouble, all talk but no brains whatsoever. We once paid her off to tell Dumbledore someone else had hexed her, and she completely fell for it. I'm just trying to figure out how she got involved in this, Sirius frowned. How did she even run across this? Harry felt a little stirring, the normal place where he should have felt a memory, but of course there was still nothing. Still, it was at least a little comforting he would get an answer for this, but for now none of them had the faintest idea. Poor thing, I'll make sure to leave the next murder for you, Sirius snarled. Remus couldn't help but frown, still torn between curiosity and disgust at what he was hearing. This thing, this form of Voldemort, was clearly more substantial than what they'd last seen in Quirrell. He must have some kind of body now if he needed feeding, as he said, but it sounded useless, like an infant to die if not tended to. That still didn't explain what he even was. Had he somehow taken over the body of an actual baby? Why not, if he could have just taken another body, even take the rat's? On top of all these questions was the assured desire he did not want the answers. He'd much rather hear about whatever this thing was dying, and the rat betraying him and leaving him behind like he had to them, and no Voldemort would ever be a problem again. Oh, Lily couldn't help but frown. At least two names coming to mind of who this could refer to, Snape and Malfoy. Both were known Death Eaters. Even that executioner that had been supposed to kill Buckbeak, Macnair, could be a candidate, and Merlin knew how many others there still were out there. Now that Voldemort had any follower, he was already back in business of killings and disappearances, with an incompetent fool at his side. She didn't want to think what he could do with even more followers, which he would probably get with the rat, quietly spreading the word around the Dark Lord was back. James couldn't help but press the heels of his hands into his eyes until he saw bright spots, nearly knocking his glasses off, just trying to give himself something else to concentrate on. But even that didn't help the cruel noise he made upon hearing that. It just wasn't getting any easier to hear these kinds of things over and over again. Sirius couldn't stop a strangled-like noise, like he wanted to give a harsh laugh at how much he agreed with that statement, but it would once again be agreeing with anything Voldemort ever said or did. Remus could vividly hear that voice in his head, because it was the same one he always used whenever he had to tell the others he couldn't come over for the summer because of his mother. For the first time, he remembered that she'd supposedly been given an order of Merlin because of what everyone thought Peter had done, and he couldn't help but wonder if she was even still alive. Most likely not, or he'd like to think he would have gone groveling back to her even before Voldemort. Then again, that was most likely a place where he would be looked for, so maybe not. Either way, it didn't make him feel one tiny bit better that he could perfectly hear the tone and picture the face of someone who was once a brother now acting like this around Voldemort. Harry couldn't help but blink hard, wondering what on earth that could mean. Why did he get yet another feeling that this was something important he should remember? It involved Pettigrew, though, so he really didn't want to know. Not terrified enough, Sirius grumbled. James couldn't help but frown as he realized, selfishly, he would almost feel a sense of relief if he found out Voldemort killed the rat. It would make matters more complicated for Sirius. He'd still much rather find out the rat was dragged forward and his real brother's name was cleared. But some tiny little part of him couldn't help but want that the very being the rat had thrown his life away, for it had also been his undoing. Lily got a terrible taste in her mouth, not even wanting to consider what kind of questioning had been going on to make that girl seemingly useless. Oh, but it would have made our life so much better, Remus growled. Sirius grumbled something inarticulate about how this would be the least of that rat's problems when he was done with him. She had a memory charm placed on her, Lily muttered, finding this more and more confusing as time wore on. Who had that rat run across that was so important it had seemed to help Voldemort in every way possible? That can't be good, Harry agreed, while the boys remained in stony-faced silence, and both Harry and Lily knew they weren't going to be managing much else until this conversation ended. You know, it's true when even a muggle who hasn't understood a portion of this conversation realizes that, Sirius agreed grimly. Harry really couldn't help the smallest of smiles. He always appreciated when his name was a question rather than the celebrity. Oh, please do hurry, Lily couldn't help but agree. She knew those muggle cops wouldn't have a clue as to what Frank would be telling them, but she also knew the Ministry kept an ear in almost all branches of the muggle world to help stray away any magical problems. Surely something like this would crop up on their radar, and something would be done about this long before it reached the level of hurting her son. Wish he'd get on with it, James muttered, his leg beginning to bounce around in unease. This man was in mortal danger, and he needed to get out of that house now. Lily couldn't help a little keening noise at Hogwarts. This could not be good, because one name clearly came to mind of who that could be referring to. She hoped desperately she was wrong, even if she hated Severus more now than ever after the way he treated Remus last year. She still liked to think he wouldn't go so far as to help Voldemort murder Harry. She held no confidence in the idea, though, and she knew without a doubt the boys wouldn't even give him this benefit of the doubt. She held to her promise she'd made James give, though, twisting away at herself that it wouldn't come to the worst. Hissing, Remus mumbled. Isn't that what Parseltongue sounds like to other people? Harry asked with a frown. Yep, Sirius muttered, feeling a cold chill run up his spine as he thought he now understood who Nagini might be. I wish, James huffed. Oh, this can't be good, Remus realized before he reminded himself it was already at that level. Lily let out a breathy whistle, then frowned with puzzled confusion. She realized this was clearly Nagini, but how could you milk a snake? The only thing that could be referring to was the venom, but snakes that big didn't produce venom. They were either strangling size or poisonous. She'd never heard of one that could do both. What else could they have meant earlier, though? Even if this was some hybrid creation she'd never heard of, why would Voldemort be drinking snake venom to make himself better? What the bloody hell was he that this would do any good? Why did it have to be a snake? James groaned. He'd had more than enough terror from those beasts from the basilisk. What kind of snake is that? Lily asked Remus, hoping he'd have a better idea than her. He just shrugged, though, admitting the same thing she had, venomous snakes that big didn't exist. Unless it was some rare or undiscovered species, he had no clue, which agitated him to no end. Never mind, I'll take the snake, James winced, now wishing he could lend this poor man Gryffindor's sword or pretty much anything to get him out of this mess, which he was quickly coming to realize wasn't possible. That's not so insane, Sirius sighed. Muggles have people who claim to talk to animals all the time. Was that really relevant right now? Remus demanded. Why does it have to be relevant? Sirius demanded right back, a smile finally showing again at any loose and friendly conversation again. Why would you say it if it wasn't? James happily jumped in. For the hell of it, Sirius smirked with a shrug, and looked likely to even carry on, except Lily cut him off to keep going. She fully recognized what her boys were trying to do, delay the inevitable at this point, because they were all well aware that this poor man was not going to get out of that house. Plus, they would find any reason to smile again after the already horrid morning they had been having. But she didn't think pushing it off would make it any better to hear. Lily couldn't help a tiny little whimper. She didn't even know this man. She hadn't known Bertha either. But the fact that this book was starting off with yet more murders and all of these unspeakable things happening just felt so sad and foreboding. It was the worst kind of omen for when they finally did get back to what she wanted to hear, Harry. James was actually quite happy. He couldn't really picture that. His physical description wasn't nearly so radically changed like Sirius, nor had he reached the level of unhealthy Remus often did. But this was still different enough to what he'd seen days ago that it was no more pleasant a reminder. All five of them couldn't help but frown at that. Only Lily and James had ever seen Voldemort at his full power, and they could attest that he was by no means short. It only reinforced all the more that whatever he was now, it wasn't human. Can we replace that little rat with him? Sirius couldn't help but think, liking this man more and more as time went on, and feeling all the more terrible he was fixing to hear his end come too soon. Why would you say that? Lily couldn't help but moan. He should have played dumb, said he hadn't understood a word. I still wouldn't put it past Voldemort to have him killed, but throwing that in their face was a terrible idea. Like he said, though, James offered with a sad smile. Bravery took hold of him. I think he knew quite well what was fixing to happen to him, so he set his backbone and wasn't going to back down. Lily sighed, but acquitted it was the same thing she might have done in that circumstance. Credit to him, that was a truly inspirational on the spot, but honestly he'd probably just go murder that wife, so it's just as well, Remus huffed with pity. Stupid effing legilimency, Sirius kept saying under his breath, thinking that was one of the worst and most violating things any wizard had ever created. Truly, it was sad what they all knew without a doubt what was fixing to happen to this man, and yet they still couldn't help but smile when they saw how he was acting. He had some spunk and iron to him, something all of them knew well. I'll give you that one, Sirius nodded. You are far less than that. James couldn't help a muffled snort, just picturing Sirius saying that to his flattened face and what kind of reaction he'd receive. Lily couldn't bring herself to sound very upset at those lines, thinking that little rat deserved any displeasure he was feeling. This was his rotten choice, and she'd happily find him regretting it to his soon dying breath. He'll wish that was the worst thing he has to deal with, Remus snapped. Lily couldn't help but pause. Even if she never met this man and wouldn't have known any better about this before reading that, she still felt a moment of silence was called for. None of the boys said anything either. There was a pitying frown on every face for this having happened, or was going to happen, whichever. What? None of them could help it. They were far past the point of writing off anything as a coincidence, and the fact that Harry had awoken at that exact moment was truly mind-blowing and terrifying. After all, they never had found out why Harry's scar had been hurting him in his first year, but they had realized it had something to do with Voldemort. Now here Harry was, reacting to something else Voldemort had just done. They didn't actually think it was possible, but that had been the worst way this chapter could have ended. They'd long since realized that Harry's scar had been paining him through the whole of his first year, because Voldemort had been around Harry, though not truly there, because of his shared body with Quirrell, which is why it hadn't been a literal constant pain, unless he was practically right on top of Harry. Of course, none of them even knew why that happened, but for the book to be saying something like that gave all of them chills. They did not want at the implications. This meant that Voldemort was near Harry again. Of course, it had also just said this happened many miles away, so since that clearly wasn't the case, what the bloody hell was going on now? Why would Harry's scar be hurting because Voldemort had used that spell? Why, though, none of this was adding up. Lily, keep going, James demanded, trying to peek down at the pages when she kept throwing worried looks at her son. That was the end of the chapter, Lily sighed, passing the book to James for his turn. Chapter 2, The Scar. Chapter text, but it didn't even say what Voldemort was now, didn't describe him or anything. Remus couldn't help but grumble before James could start. That's what you're concerned with, Sirius scoffed. You want to hang up a picture of him now or something? No, Remus rolled his eyes indulgently at the teasing. But clearly whatever he's using as a body now is weak and vulnerable. I'd like to see just how much so, and how easy it would be to destroy. Hopefully Harry doesn't find out, but someone just tells him later, James sighed without any hope as he began. Dream, huh? Lily grumbled, wondering at this point if it was even worth it to hope that was true. Apparently not. She sighed along with the rest of the boys, never appreciating that kind of thing being told without someone around Harry to at least notice and be concerned about it. Wait, what? Remus yelped. He still wasn't sure on why Harry could sense Voldemort even being around because of that scar. Now he was seeing things Voldemort had. Remus always looked kind of sickly right after a full moon, but this wasn't his normal pale tone. I don't know, Harry sighed, recognizing he hadn't really been expected to answer, but those same questions bothering him as well, and he still felt like he should justify himself. I've no idea why I saw all of that. The parents still looked shell-shocked, so Sirius forced himself to come out of it first, giving Harry a gentle nudge and saying to all of them, "Well, we'll figure it out, I'm sure." He paused and actually managed to smile despite his own growing worry when Harry looked like he wanted to agree before muttering to himself about his memories some more. For now, let's just hope that's all you'll be seeing. I'd rather this not become a habit. He finished by giving James an imploring look, one that he did agree with, and so just forced himself to keep reading, mostly since none of them had any answers to give even if they did keep sitting around to think about this. Thanks, because I hadn't gotten rid of that reminder yet, Sirius hissed under his breath. Unbelievably, he'd found that this still bothered him less than what was going on with Harry, and that wasn't necessarily a good thing. Okay, Lily said, trying to keep her voice as calm as possible. So, Harry wasn't actually seeing what Voldemort was or any connection to him. He was just seeing that room at that time, for some reason. She trailed off miserably as this still helped nothing, and they had no idea why this could be happening. They all gave a horrible wince at that, never wanting their Harry in the same room as someone who had just been murdered. He'd already had to suffer through that once with his own mother, and thankfully he'd been too young to even realize that until those bleeding dementors had exposed him to the memory. They did not want that to linger in him at all. Why would you want to remember this? James shuddered, wanting to erase those images from his own mind, let alone letting Harry dwell on them. James still couldn't read that name without a ferocious bite to his words, let alone sighed along with Voldemort's name. Lily groaned, shaking all over and wanting to steal away her infant from Remus, to go to Harry's side and never let go. She just didn't want to keep hearing about her baby being in an attempted murder, even if it never happened. She stayed herself, though, thinking she'd look ridiculous for overreacting like that when clearly they were both fine now. That gave them all another shot of hate, though for a different reason this time, as they remembered all over again what house Harry was most likely at. These stupid books had yet to just skip to Harry going to Ron's place. No, so far they'd had to suffer at least some time of Harry at the Dursleys' expense, and they had no faith this time would be any different, as the book had already referred to Harry being in his room. It was all the more bitter when they had just been so close to Harry getting out of there via Sirius. How clearly at least some time had passed, and Sirius was probably still in the exact same situation as when they'd left him, and it wasn't making any of them feel any better. Falling asleep to a Quidditch book, Remus tried for a soft, joking tone, looking for anything pleasant to think on, and at least this was still something he could grasp that Rat couldn't take away from him. James would fall asleep like that all the time. Sirius swore it was the one way to make him settle for 5 minutes straight. Because it always worked, Sirius agreed. James stuck his tongue out at the pair, but didn't deny the claim either. A world-renowned opinion that any sane person shares. James agreed with a firm nod, giving his wife an obvious look which she just as obviously ignored. Bet you Ron got him that one in particular, Sirius smirked, remembering this was Ron's preferred team. After he got done memorizing it, Remus agreed. Thanks for that reminder, I didn't want, Lily grumbled, trying to keep that to herself so as not to spoil the good mood the boys were going for, and yet Harry was probably fixing to ruin it himself if that was any start. Memorable, Remus nodded in agreement. And I still owe that idiot one for that, James agreed. James quickly lost his stride and turned an ugly green color at the reminder, as if he wanted to be the one to read that reminder. He still felt vomit slick on his tongue at that recurring nightmare. None of this is even touching on the times you weren't injured, but gave us heart failure in first year, Sirius sighed, running his hand through his hair to check and make sure it hadn't gone grey yet. Now that one I'll give you, Remus nodded fairly. We haven't even told you about the time James kept walking into walls all day and nearly broke his neck falling down a flight of stairs, and it wasn't because Sirius stole his glasses again. One time, I did that one time on a dare, Sirius said dramatically, pointing an accusing finger at the pair, and you never let me forget it. Never will, James laughed, touching the ridge of his glasses possessively. Even Lily couldn't argue this point. Magic was dangerous, and a school full of children learning to use it could cause accidents, just not the life and death kind her son usually found. Harry felt a chill crawl up his spine that felt ominous to him, and not something at all he wanted to linger on. Sirius couldn't help a snorting noise that sounded much the same to Harry. He just couldn't help picturing his pup being all tense and jumpy, and then nearly hitting the ceiling because of that harmless noise. Not stupid, Remus argued at once. It's never stupid to be cautious and prepared. You're going off of an experience from before and trying to do the same thing now. Harry nodded in agreement, but still couldn't shake that bad feeling that he was getting more insight into Voldemort than he ever wanted, and it wasn't going to go away any time soon. Though they do give me plenty cause for worry, Lily snapped. For now, James muttered with pure venom, knowing that two wouldn't last long when they could leave this place again, and those Dursleys would soon be having nightmares for the rest of their short lives about him. Not breathing at all is how I like them best, Sirius grumbled. The two parents still felt a terrible twitch inside of them every time they were forced to hear or say that, still wanting with everything in the world to claim that wasn't true, and still seething every moment it wasn't. Sirius gave a terrible sneer, now hoping his own name would be cropping up very soon just so he could hear about how terrified they were of him, that they'd been treating Harry like a prince since they found out what would happen to them otherwise by Sirius if they didn't. Oh, thank you, because we really wanted to be reminded of that, Remus sighed with an eye roll, that stupid lie still making him want to give them a few special curses. James and Lily slumped back in their seats, still not able to knock aside the image this shouldn't be Harry's life. He should have been able to go in their room at 14 and wake them and tell them of this terrible thing he was fearing, and they could soothe him just fine than like they were now. Lily groaned and began rubbing furiously at her temple, dearly tempted to just beg James at this point to skip this part. She hadn't thought it possible before, but hearing this over and over again, and now with a real person to blame for the source of it, still somehow got worse every time. In that order, James still mentally ragged, still hating himself for not having stalled Voldemort long enough for his wife and son to get out, thinking that if he could only fix one thing he'd make sure it was that. Did someone tell you what that spell was? Remus managed to stutter out, not wanting to think about this more than anyone else, that vivid mental image of James, and Lily still left dead to be discovered by Sirius, still leaving him a ragged mess. But sometimes he really couldn't stop himself from blurting out those questions. No, Harry mumbled, not meeting anyone's eyes, always hating himself for thinking on these things so much during the summer because somehow either of his parents always ended up being one of the ones to read about it. Just kind of put that together back from what Hagrid had told me. Of course, there was one spell they all thought had been used, but there was no barrier for that spell. No way could anyone survive it, so it must be something else other than Avada Kedavra. I still struggle to remember that part, James grumbled, always having wanted his name to be famous, and that mockery still smarting just as much now as when he'd first learned this. Sirius couldn't help a tiny frown, realizing that of course Harry would want to tell his friends before him. He had known them longer, but still hoping he at least made the list. Then he wondered if he was even still in regular contact with Harry. Being on the run probably didn't make for great communication. No, I'm really serious, Sirius smirked, still not regretting it one bit as everyone else groaned, but Harry still cracked a smile at that gag. I sincerely doubt that, Remus smiled, thinking Harry had his friend spot on at this reaction. Remus had never even technically met Hermione, and he could picture her at once doing these exact things. Something we're still thankful for, James said at once with a forced smile. Even if we do question it to kingdom come, Remus sighed. That still shouldn't stop you from sending Hedwig. She'd still find him, Lily shrugged, her opinion of Dumbledore at an all-time low after what had been implied he'd done to Sirius, but unable to deny he should still be informed of this. Remus didn't even try to smother a blithe laugh that wasn't something he'd ever thought up before. It didn't totally erase his own pondering question that just now occurred to him, whether he, like Sirius, would even be considered written to about this. Harry had made no indication at the end of last year this would be a thing, and he wondered if he was giving himself too much credit. Harry may not have been showing it now, but he had basically lied to the boy all year about things he really should have told Harry instead of being the coward he was and barely acknowledging him as anything other than a student. He resisted asking Harry, deciding he couldn't begrudge him if he never spoke his name again for that reason alone. That about covers it, yeah. James nodded like this made perfect sense. Might want to throw something in about the weather, Sirius offered, just to keep things polite. Lily released a snort of mirth, knowing these boys meant it, and they probably would do something like this, as collective all three boys didn't own an ounce of subtleness. Don't see why that should stop you, Remus shrugged, clearly meaning it, making Lily start giggling even harder, and for Harry to join in after a moment, to the blank-faced confusion of the boys. James just ignored it, though, still continuing. So glad I didn't seem to hurt Ron's personality as much as his leg. Sirius gave a weak laugh at that, some lingering guilt still getting to him for that, but positive if he'd done anything permanent it would have been mentioned at the last book, so he tried to let that one go. Sadly, not Arthur's department, Lily sighed, and meaning it. She'd love for Harry, or at least Harry's friend, to know someone who did have a more hands-on knowledge about this type of thing, but since Harry's situation was unique, and no one really qualified under that, she didn't see it happening. Jumpy is a bit strong, Sirius shrugged. You're being legitimately concerned about something that's troubling you. Yeah, but it still sounds ridiculous out loud. My scar hurt while I was sleeping, Harry shrugged, still trying to brush it off now like he had then. It wasn't working as well. They each gave him a knowing look saying they didn't agree, but since he didn't want to linger on this any more with them, then he had his friends he still waved his dad on. Oh, the horror! James couldn't stop a smirk, knowing the way to stop any boy from doing something was the fear that his peers would think him weak. Even with the terrible start they'd had to this book, none of them could stop themselves from perking up with interest at the mention of this. Even Lily wanted nothing more than to go a whole chapter of hearing nothing more than some innocent fun of a sport, to go without the fear of something happening to or even around Harry. Ron really needed to hurry up with that letter. I can sympathize that, Remus nodded seriously, that having been a problem once or twice over his own summer holidays, and much rather not talking about where he'd given himself a new scar. It wasn't the same, but he did get where Harry was coming from and could not stop his voice from wavering, his tone switching from a forced neutral to that same empty feeling he kept getting. But he forced himself to clear his throat as hard as he could to get rid of it, and looked Harry in the eye, which helped as he declared, "That is not shameful. That is something everyone needs." And his words only halted for the briefest second. The other three may not even have noticed, even if Lily did. You've got a pretty good substitute. He finished with a slight incline at Sirius. Sirius couldn't help a little smirk. All too pleased James had just admitted he could be counted on for giving any good advice, as he knew his best friend would regularly deny that, hoping very much himself now that Harry would tell him about this. That's okay. He's usually the last person on everyone's mind, Lily snarked, her smile only broadening when Sirius stuck his tongue out at her, which still didn't erase his grin that Harry thought that about him. What's there to phrase? Remus shrugged, still almost successfully ignoring that small little sting he clearly hadn't crossed Harry's mind, and he now officially doubted he would at all, as he was sure if he had it would have been right along with Sirius. Just tell him, hey, my scar hurt. How are you, Harry? You lot are just so loquacious. Lily rolled her eyes, knowing full well Remus still wasn't joking. They may talk their heads off, causing them to take forever just to get through one chapter, but clearly having no idea how to correctly put said things to ink, something she was well aware from the letters she received from James. Well, technically you found out during your Christmas break, like 7 months ago at that point, Sirius shrugged. I didn't think it counted up until the 2-month point, Harry muttered with a slight blush. Now that he knew how wrong those feelings were, he never wanted to revisit his initial reaction to finding out about Sirius again, and no one argued the point. And I thank you for that reminder as well. James shuddered with still fresh horror of Sirius being in there, successfully pushing that stupid little green ball of envy away that Harry was turning to Sirius for something like this. Of course James was happy Harry had someone like that. No, it had nothing to do with the fact James still wanted that to be him. I wish, Remus growled, causing the baby in his arms to give a slight stir of discomfort, forcing Remus not to continue even though James still did under his breath for a moment before collecting himself. Remus now brought the little baby up and placed him gently on his shoulder like he was repositioning him, just to ignore that little smack he hadn't even been mentioned. Great, Harry forgot he even existed now. James had only managed to get through all of that again by intermittently repeating several things he never would have considered saying in the first place. But that fire-hungry rage was back, and he'd still much rather be on a rampage looking for that stupid rat than revisiting this. Well, misfortune was putting it kindly. Lily wrapped her arm tightly around James' waist, her nails digging into his hip, but neither of them really noticing, because they would still take Sirius in a heartbeat, mild jealousy and all, just for that to still be true and soon. Well, this at least ought to be fun, Sirius muttered, still looking just as surely and violent and doubting that would change any time soon. That's the least terrible thing they've done, Remus still grumbled under his breath. Ha! Sirius hadn't expected the bark-like laugh to escape from him, but he didn't try to smother it either as it subsided into childish giggles that Harry was using that card, and he couldn't be more proud. My little marauder, Junior, James cooed happily, his eyes shining with mirth and pride, playing them like that about scary old Padfoot. I don't know prongs, Remus gave a wicked grin. I still wouldn't put it past him to not be innocent much longer when he meets them in person. We can only hope, Lily nodded with a devilish grin. Harry was giving half-hearted laughter at what he hoped was all teasing. Sirius beamed, just happy he could be sending letters at all. He of course wished it could be more frequent, but he'd take anything to hear he was still looking out for Harry and still able to. Harry wasn't the only one who made a startled little noise at that, as he happily exclaimed, I didn't even know you could use anything other than owls. It's like with owls in the wild, Sirius happily smirked, now thinking he wouldn't mind getting his pet owl Buggle a friend. Those exotic birds sounded cool. It's not impossible to find some intelligent enough to be pulling this off, just a little more difficult. Unless it was the same one twice, and you made a new friend, Remus teased. James carefully placed the book down and marked his spot before actually applauding Sirius, who happily chucked a pillow at him to shut him up, grumbling about how he could be plenty smart when he wanted to. James was still snickering to himself as he kept going. They can survive in sunlight, sadly. Remus couldn't stop himself from correcting. They turn the environment so unpleasant it suits them, so sadly you still don't have a real advantage. And this is why you made a great teacher. Sirius rolled his eyes at him. You are a killjoy. Remus made a face at him but declined responding, that stinging more than he'd expected it to. Dudley's on a diet, Lily repeated, looking nearly faint from shock and trying to peek off James to see if he was fibbing that part. Don't think there's a diet in the world to fix that mess, Remus gagged, remembering his last description hadn't been a kind one. I just can't believe his parents are doing it, not to their precious little blimp. Sirius managed to both crinkle his nose in disgust at the remembered size of that kid and still sounded disbelieving. Harry had a slight grin on his face as he nodded confirmation that was true, the memory easily resurfacing now about the pre-tantrum to this having occurred. Before James could break off to ask, Harry inserted, I tell Sirius what it is. James was pretty dang proud of himself that of all the trivial things he'd learned in these past few days, he actually still remembered what a computer was, and he didn't have to ask again. All four of them went blank-faced at that, though, finding the title a pretty odd one and quite violent for a children's game. That's still pretty tame and a little foreboding, Sirius muttered, his eyes narrowing with distaste, hoping he'd gotten around to asking in his other two letters why Harry wouldn't be okay there otherwise. Harry kept himself as unconcerned as possible, still avoiding all eyes and really hoping this subject would just be glossed over again soon. Thankfully, we know the answer to that. Lily still couldn't stop one last shudder, hoping that distance never lessened any. Sadly not, Sirius sighed, wishing he was more of an expert on that subject, but still feeling touched, Harry trusted him enough to ask at all. Got to agree with you on that part. Sirius might blow up an island in agitation, Remus tried for a joke, though it came out more feeble than he'd meant, as he wasn't too sure he wasn't wrong. Sirius still looked so agitated about who all had been in that dream. I'll bet I saw right past that even in that letter, Sirius still scoffed, looking abundantly pleased with himself, a little too much in James' opinion. Joyful, James grumbled, giving the book a hard toss to Sirius, who deftly caught it and went, none too happy, to the next chapter. Now someone out there, help me with this one, because I'm lost. In every future thing like this, Harry does see from Voldemort's perspective, but this was the same third-person perspective, as if Harry really had just been looking in the window. That's never explained. And I've got nothing. Harry isn't a seer. He never has this ability around Voldemort again. I really have no way to explain this. It's from Frank's point of view, and he has no mental connection to him. Would love to hear some theories. Chapter 3. The Invitation. Chapter text Sirius sighed with complete distaste as he began. They were already off to a terrible start with all this Voldemort and the traitor talk. Now he got the misfortune of getting the chapter that would most likely turn him into a murderous fool all over again at what these Dursleys had been up to involving his pup. A feat I hadn't thought possible, James snorted. Remus may have felt pity for anyone else, having to eat unsweetened anything, but found that this was probably the best form of torture that could be inflicted on these Dursleys, and it was self-inflicted, so he had no qualms. Lily made a scathing noise, vividly remembering how both hers and Petunia's marks had been carefully monitored, and if not up to their parents' standards, they'd at least have a talking to. But compared to what all she'd heard, she wouldn't be surprised if Dudley flunked every class and Petunia didn't bat an eye. Yes, every single teacher at that school misunderstands him. Not one of them could grasp, at this elite school they've sent Dudley to, how to teach him, James snorted. Don't think Merlin could have taught this fool how to count, Sirius smirked. Harry in particular gave an eye roll at that exaggeration, as he had the childhood marks to prove otherwise. No, Hagrid has big bones, Remus enunciated as if the idiots were present. That child has more fat than bone. I really am stumped at just how blind or stupid she is. Sirius shook his head at how pathetic this kept getting. I really cannot picture that. That's just terrible. Lily's frown kept deepening. Even if she didn't like Dudley, it was because of his parents he was this way. It was made all the worse that it mainly seemed to be Petunia's fault he got like this, though Vernon certainly wasn't stepping in to stop anything. Considering how he reacted when Harry got his second bedroom, I think we should be grateful shouting seems to have been it, James huffed. At least there wasn't a turtle thrown this time. I seem to recall that. Sirius nodded in agreement. I'm also fairly certain it was mentioned he kicked one of his parents, so I'm with you on this, Lily grumbled. Wait, what? Lily yelped, turning concerned eyes on her already malnourished son while he was at that house. They were on the verge of starving you before. Now you're only getting how much? Harry, though, had a new kind of smirk on his face, not one the others saw too often, which only made the boys more excited and happy as he said, Don't worry, I don't follow it. Lily did not look encouraged, but James was definitely more eager now to find out how Harry got around this. Are you kidding me? Sirius frowned. You had to be the skinniest one at that table, but you still somehow got less food than Dudley. Harry gave an absent shrug, well aware of Petunia's view that if Harry suffered just that little more than Dudley, it was somehow okay. No, that is not how that works. You foul, horrible excuse for a person. Lily seethed. One boy should not have to suffer to make the other feel better. Merlin, Petunia, is that why you went out of your way to try and ruin my life growing up? Lily went on a tangent for a few more minutes before she finally ran out of steam. There was a lot more colorful and violent things tossed in there, which left the boys shrinking back in genuine fright, even if they did agree. She'd clearly been wanting to say all of that for quite some time, and just seemed to have finally found her perfect opportunity. It was quite the opposite reaction she'd had from back in the first book when Petunia had called her sister a freak when Hagrid had arrived. All of this had probably been building since then. She finally came to a stop, taking deep and slow breaths, then looked around half ashamed as she muttered, "Sorry, didn't mean to take that out on you lot." James relaxed when he realized the worst was over and placed a gentle arm around her, saying, "Nah, best to get it all out. Want to start in on anyone else?" "It might just be you if you don't keep reading," Lily returned, trying for a normal smile. James wasn't actually sure if she was kidding or not, so he decided it was best not to test her. Really would have liked to read those," Remus frowned, wondering how on earth Harry could have phrased this so it wouldn't be so alarming that at least the Weasleys would have said something to Dumbledore. Harry was asking his friends to send him food. How on earth could that be considered normal? Shouldn't someone have come and checked on him because of that? The others were thinking the exact same thing. But as always, when they looked expectantly at Harry like they wanted him to elaborate, he ignored everyone's eye and instead looked pleadingly to the book like he was hoping it would read itself to get him out of this. Sirius was feeling pretty confident by now that if he confronted Harry, he could probably whittle enough he might really tell him now. James, on the other hand, clearly wasn't as he recognized his son, still didn't want to talk about this, and not wanting to force it out of him kept going. "I don't think Harry phrased it the way we were thinking, if all he's going to get in return is snacks," Lily sighed, starting to feel a little fidgety again. She really didn't want to spend any time on the thought that her son was only living on tiny snacks and carrot sticks, definitely not the proper nutrition a growing boy needed. "Yeah, I'm pretty sure Harry's still in the starving category with that," Sirius muttered. "Honestly making me wonder why you wrote to tell Hagrid at all," Remus couldn't help but think, but held that one in. James couldn't help a little snort of surprise. He could just imagine Ron receiving his letter from Harry asking if he could be sent a snack or something, and this was Molly's response. What would she do if she knew the full extent of Harry's stay there? He was actually hoping to hear about this now. Was it sadder that they weren't surprised anymore, or that it still bothered them just as much as the first time to hear that? Just the fact that they continually, no matter what, kept doing their very best to leave Harry at his worst left them with the desire to strangle the lot of them every time. James lost it. He was reduced into almost hysterical laughter as he tried to imagine Sirius filching a cake from a bakery to send to Harry, or even better, trying to break into someone's house just to pull this off. Of all the things for him to be doing while on the run, Sirius wasn't a particularly good cook. He'd never had to learn, so the idea was made all the more laughable if the second were true, and Sirius went through a few trials before he'd mailed a cake off to Harry with one of those tropical birds. "Oh, come on," Lily wheezed, not looking much better herself. "I think it's sweet." "Thank you, Lily," Sirius said with a snooty voice. He was proud of himself for considering something like this. He more than owed it to Harry. Remus was the only one who couldn't bring himself to even muster up a smile, hunkering down in his seat, and deciding this was the final straw. He officially had completely forgotten about Harry. He must have decided when he left Hogwarts he was just leaving everything. Maybe he was just busy, searching down that traitor, and not even realizing the passing time, but it still didn't sit right with him. He completely phased back out of Harry's life without any mention. He didn't think the others noticed. He certainly hoped they wouldn't, as he had no way to explain himself. "I still can't say I'm happy with this." Lily really did settle back down with a crinkled nose. "They'd surely go stale, and you don't need to be living off of just cake any more than carrot sticks." "Better than no food at all," Sirius grumbled, which Lily acknowledged. "He's probably going to get in trouble for that, and I still don't care." James rolled his eyes. All five of them either groaned or sighed, either for the you comment or because Harry had just woken up. What could he be blamed for already? He wishes. Harry muttered. "So what?" Sirius snapped. "And you actually restrained yourself." James cocked a brow in surprise. "I am impressed." Lily's eyes narrowed with furious curiosity, pondering at the phrasing of that as she didn't like to think of that man's temper at all. "Who'd be writing to you through Muggle mail?" Remus asked, distracted from his own self-pity for now to think on this. "Search me," Harry shrugged, now mimicking the expression of puzzled. "Ah, so it's from one of Ron's parents," Lily stated, though this still managed to increase their confusion. "Why would they be writing to the Dursleys like this?" A few interesting things came to mind, but it didn't seem the Weasleys' type. And a big no to that, by the way, Sirius muttered in reference to the actual letter, as he was well aware Harry wouldn't go talking to the Dursleys about needing new socks, let alone chatting about his friends. James couldn't help a little squeal as he read that. Prime tickets. His son was going to see the World Cup in person. While he would never not be agitated at the very existence of the Dursleys, at least this was something good he could latch onto. I'm going with probably not. Remus smiled warmly, thinking that most Muggle posts wouldn't be able to find a wizard village. What does she mean enough? Lily asked, already a smile creeping onto her face at this prospect. Really, I don't know how you pull that off, Sirius said eagerly. Only James was left frowning in mild confusion as he read that. But he didn't have to really ask as the others burst into laughter. He could guess that perhaps she had put too many stamps on, though he found it an honest enough mistake, as he wasn't even sure why Muggles would put stamps on their mail. Lily smiled indulgently as she approved. I give her credit for asking like that and trying to be polite, even enough to do it the Muggle way. At least somebody appreciates it. Remus nodded in agreement, knowing Vernon wouldn't feel the same. Because it was, James snorted, much to the amusement of everyone else who nearly started cracking up again at the realization he would have done the exact same thing. Be a little more worried if he didn't, Sirius marked. Well, how dare he? Remus sneered. Damn near wish I was, Lily hissed, still wanting more than anything to have never come across this name. Then they're in for a very nasty surprise. James grinned, though it had something lingering that made it very obvious this wasn't meant to be pleasant. Pretty sure that's because stringing words together is too complicated for his pea brain, Sirius muttered. I think I've successfully called him everything under the sun at this point, Remus groused, and it's still not enough to cover how wrong that is. I hate having him in that house too, Lily snapped. I'm not surprised he automatically despises anyone who'd be writing to Harry, James sighed. It really bothered Sirius that Harry still couldn't speak freely in that house, like he was conditioned even before he knew Sirius would back him up now. Harry must know that Vernon couldn't do anything to Harry now no matter what he said, or Sirius would apparate there faster than Vernon's eyes could flash. He glanced at his godson now to see he looked just as sheepish, and closed off as he always did whenever his life at the Dursleys was ever brought up. Dumpy! Lily yelped in outrage. She knew for a fact that Vernon had no right to be tossing that word around to anyone when his son's fat ass couldn't fit into a recognized sizable pair of pants. That was a low blow, even from him, Sirius snarled, while the other three boys said something equal, Harry loudest of all. He may have held his tongue while in the face of Vernon, but he couldn't stand anyone saying that kind of thing about the woman who'd been so kind to him with no reason to. The lot of them were still so angry they didn't even take the chance to laugh at the expense of Dudley again. As if I didn't hate him enough already, James blustered. Really, that word is too much for him. Remus frowned, more confused than anything on this one. What does he call the broom he uses to clean the kitchen? Probably his wife's second husband, Sirius muttered under his breath. Sirius began bouncing in place and laughing again all at once, more than happy to hear Harry had seemed to brush right past his earlier problem and was saying whatever the bloody hell he wanted to now. If Vernon did anything about it, Harry could just bring up his name, and this good-for-nothing caretaker of Harry's would back down at once. You mean they don't? Lily Mark demanded. They're missing out on some golden opportunities. You're calling my son unnatural, James demanded. I've met saner people than you at Sirius House. Sirius cocked his head to the side like he was considering that before nodding and saying, yeah, I'll give you that one. They aren't even Harry's, Remus snapped. Lily groaned into her hands, hating to think of her baby being forced to dress in something like that when those same people bought their own son whatever, whenever he asked. Oh yes, you will. Sirius shot back dangerously, looking pretty close to the same description. He couldn't stand just sitting here while Harry had to take this, and he should have been able to step in and say something rather than not even being in the picture. Least Harry's really fighting back now, James said with genuine praise. He still feared retribution from them. They were older than Harry and could still get away with something before Harry got a chance to make a run for it, but Harry wasn't 10 years old anymore either. By this age, he definitely had enough in him to at least scare them enough he could make a run for it again, like he had last year if this conversation went too bad. He realized how sad this was to think about, that Harry couldn't hold one conversation with this man, and already James was fearing the worst and half hoping his son really would bolt again. Ah, the magic words, Remus beamed, knowing if this reminder didn't put Vernon in his place, nothing would. Fascinating description as always, dear. Lily gave a soft giggle. Even as stressed as her husband, she couldn't overlook that. As they should, James sneered. I don't know, I'm still a little offended it wasn't worse. Sirius gave a mock pout. Think I'm losing my touch. My name should at least cause him the runs. Why don't you go fake murder a few more people? Remus offered. I'm sure that'll do it. That's a great idea, Sirius beamed, though there was a glint in his dark eyes showing he wasn't kidding anymore. I know just where to start. James gave an appreciative laugh while Harry eyed Sirius again, always unsure and at least half hoping they really didn't mean those jokes. Least he can work that out. Lily shrugged. Now I'm just wondering how hard it would be for him to understand the concept of feeding you. One step at a time, Harry shrugged, more than happy to point out. And since I'm leaving now, it's no longer a problem anymore. Still wish you'd mentioned something to me in the first place, Sirius grumbled. Harry pursed his lips, knowing full well why he wouldn't tell Sirius a thing about the Dursleys feeding him like that, let alone anything else. He was too worried about Sirius coming back, and the most dangerous place for him to be was around the Dursleys. He'd never risk Sirius possibly getting caught, and there was just no point in telling him things that had already happened, something he was still adamant about. Pretty sure he nearly broke his jaw getting all of that out, Harry beamed, getting almost giggly. He was so happy to hear that. He was getting to spend the rest of his summer with Ron. He was going to see the World Cup. He was leaving the Dursleys and didn't have to keep avoiding his family's burning questions. Best news I've heard yet. James nodded, finally forcing some real cheer into himself and clinging to it as long as he could. Why couldn't we have just started with that? Lily agreed. Yeah, that brings up a few more memories, Remus snorted. I'm sure it is a rarity for Harry to ever smile around there, Sirius grumbled. James couldn't help a little snort of mirth, finding it the perfect cherry to rub Dudley's face in at the end. Lily hadn't a second to worry what could be making her son yelp in pain, but instead burst out laughing at the description along with everyone else. She wasn't even sure what it was that could be pelting Harry like that, but judging by the fact that Harry was rubbing that exact spot in remembered pain, but looking more amused than anything, she had no fears it was anything bad. Wasn't that how Ron's new owl was described at the end of the last book? Sirius perked up even more. Why would Ron be sending Harry a letter? Surely his mum told him she was sending something to the Muggles to ask the same thing, Remus asked. What does that have to do with Ron talking to his friend? James rolled his eyes. Lily couldn't repress another smirk. James sounded more excited about this than anything he'd read yet. The only comparison was when he was reading about Harry's Quidditch games, and those hadn't lasted long before he got upset again. Even if she didn't care for the sport much, she was genuinely happy to see her husband lighting up at anything again. Sirius couldn't even find it in himself to be disappointed his favorite team hadn't made the league. He was pent up with too much excitement to care as he exclaimed, Yes, Kenmare Kestrels versus Vratsa Vultures. I wonder how many new players are in the lineup, James began, before he launched into a whole spiel about nearly every Quidditch team, much to Lily's groan of displeasure. Yet she still couldn't bring herself to interrupt them or stop them as all of the boys joined in. She figured she'd let them have this while they could, so she went over to Remus and took baby Harry upstairs to check on his diaper. By the time she came back down and they were still in full swing, she simply nestled herself back into the couch next to her husband and began entertaining her charge by producing colorful puffs of smoke for his entertainment. The high-pitched giggling noise of the child finally drew the reappearance of her cat Hickory, who padded up onto her lap, curled himself around baby Harry, and began purring contently as the game chat continued. The picture-perfect scene turned out to be just that, as Lily heard a soft click and looked up to realize that Sirius had that grin on her face, which meant she was going to regret asking, Sirius, what did you do? Nothing, he said at once, stuffing something back behind him. She glanced up and saw James trying to smother a laugh as he said, We just realized how bored you got, so how about we press on? She smirked at them. They knew full well that hadn't worked on her but didn't protest either. Pig, Remus interrupted in confusion. The book's print was clear as day, and Sirius just shrugged, saying, "Don't ask me," while he kept going. Harry wanted to laugh and say his old rat hadn't exactly looked like a scab either. Clearly Ron just wasn't too adept at naming his pets, but chose not to bring that up as the others continued laughing at this. He wasn't going to be the one to bring the good mood back down. "Can't imagine what other word that could be," Lily giggled. "Forever adore your best friend." Sirius' grin got even wider at that. "Pretend," Remus choked, trying to stuff his own fist in his mouth to not laugh so loud Sirius would stop. James was bouncing in place so much he was starting to agitate the cat, but he just couldn't stop. He was so excited to hear about this, Harry getting away from the Dursleys more than anything. But the cup, well, good for him, Lily grinned. That was a great step in reaching his ambition of becoming minister, best department he could have stepped into for the political side. Then she sighed, knowing she and Percy's parents were most likely the only ones actually happy for him. Honestly, she really pitied Percy sometimes. She wished Harry would mention the boy had more friends he could talk to. "A very good accomplishment," Sirius snickered. "Neither can I," all four boys muttered one last time, still unable to cap their excitement for this. "I'm pretty sure you'll now be fighting the impulse to ask Harry if his dog can come along," Remus muttered under his breath. Sirius got the gist of the joke anyways, and couldn't even deny he liked the idea. "As are we," Lily nodded, giving her wand another little twist and creating a puff of purple smoke for her baby's delight. "There's the bright side," Sirius cackled. "I hope you keep that feeling just for this year," Sirius sighed as he passed Harry the book, knowing by now that asking for anything more would be a miracle in itself. Chapter 4. Back to the Burrow. Chapter text. Harry found himself flipping to the next chapter with a smile on his face, and he put it all down to the fact that he was headed over to the Burrow house. James couldn't help a little smirk. At least his cloak was mentioned first. "Assorted," Lily sniffed at their typical over-exaggeration. "It's going to be Ron, one of his parents, and that's it. They might try to make pleasant conversation for 5 seconds before they realize you're a waste of space and be done." Sirius couldn't help but squirm in agitation. He hated to think of Harry there when they were in a good mood. He didn't like to think of him being around when they were even more bad-tempered with him than normal. "Oh yes, because they're so likely to come in their nightgowns," Remus snorted. "What does he mean by normal?" James frowned. "If they showed up in their best black tie, Vernon would still hate them, so it doesn't really matter," Lily huffed. All 5 of them were frowning for that very same reason now. None of them wanted to hear about this exchange. It might have the one benefit of making the Weasleys look further into Harry's care there. It just sort of depended on how bad this got. "Sadly, we know better," Sirius sighed. "A feat he would marvelously fail at no matter what he's wearing," Remus scathed. "Still one of my favorite moments," Sirius snickered. James didn't even try to smother his cackle that was hilarious and deserved. Lily shuddered in protest of imagining her poor boy eating that, thankful that the moment Harry arrived at the Weasleys they'd stuff more than enough food down him. "I'm not even going to ask for what," Remus rolled his eyes. That gave them all a pause as they considered this for the first time. The most common way for them to travel was apparition, but neither of Ron's parents would attempt that with 2 minors. "Maybe Mr. Weasley did get another car and drove it there," James offered with a small smirk. "I somehow doubt it," Lily huffed. "After the catastrophe of the last one, even with the end results." "Well then, I've got nothing." Remus shrugged, waving Harry on with curiosity now. "Makes sense," Lily nodded in agreement. "Can't say I'm remotely surprised," Sirius mumbled. James just rolled his eyes. He didn't need to ask to grasp that this must just be a very nice style of car. Remus couldn't help a little snort of surprise at such a random comparison, though he rather liked the idea. "Really, because I'm rather enjoying it." James couldn't help a little sneer, any discomfort those Dursleys ever carried managing to vindictively cheer him up. "Uh-oh," Sirius muttered, raising a brow in surprise. "Maybe Arthur got stuck at the office," Lily offered with a small frown, thinking there were plenty of logical reasons as to why either he or Marley could be running late. "Or traffic," Remus agreed, unable to get his tone quite to the careless level he wanted. They were probably all being paranoid for no reason, but it was hard to fight off after so many stressful days in a row. They really needed this to just be some simple mistake, and not something terrible having happened to the Weasleys next. And you're an arse, Lily muttered. She was sure it wasn't 5 minutes, and he was already jumping at Harry for it. Harry was trying, as lightly as possible, to dig at his feelings and wonder if that anxious feeling got worse, and was pleased to find he didn't think the night ended too badly. Surely that meant nothing disastrous happened. It really was just an innocent mistake of being late. His tone carried that as he kept reading, managing to relax the others a little bit. It's not as if they could call you and tell you. Lily rolled her eyes. Who on earth thinks like that? Sirius scoffed. I somehow doubt that, James scoffed, thinking that at least Ron would have mailed something to Harry otherwise. Remus sighed, sick of listening to this man categorize the whole of wizards. He hated stereotyping in general. Lily couldn't help but start when Harry started up with that noise, all eyes now watching him wearily like Harry was fixing to announce something had been set on fire. His safe haven, Sirius nodded absently. The second Sirius recognized what Harry was describing, he cracked up laughing, managing to melt all tension in the room. Someone, he managed to gasp. Someone's got themselves stuck in the chimney. They tried to flew there. Lily added with an indulgent grin. Why would you board up a fireplace? James asked, a crazy smile on his own face at how absurd the idea was. Some muggles prefer electric fireplaces, Remus shrugged, not bothering to cover his mirth one bit. What I'm curious is how the Weasleys even pulled this off. Muggle fireplaces aren't connected to the flue. I'm assuming Arthur worked something out with the Ministry, Lily managed while still half giggling. Fred, Remus repeated in surprise. Why would the twins come along? Why wouldn't they? James smirked, just an innocent pickup of their friend. Probably told their dad they wanted to see a Muggle house in daylight. He'd have eaten that right up, Remus agreed. Surprised Molly let them, after the last time they snuck off there, Lily said. How were they supposed to get back? Sirius chuckled. They'd have to flew, and there's clearly no fire or setting a fire while they're stuck in there. James was now at least pretending to suppress his laughter as he stuffed his fist in his mouth to keep hearing what was happening. No one had an actual answer for Sirius, though, so Harry kept going. Harry was having trouble keeping his own amusement under a lid as he kept going. Oh, he'd been able to hear every word, and though he felt plenty bad for the fix they'd wound up in, the situation was too priceless not to at least give a little chuckle. The smile slipped right off of Lily's face at least, detesting that the very first thing they did was turn on Harry in anger for something he'd had no control over. It didn't matter how many times she heard it happen to him, she would never not hate it. Oh, Harry, it's not mad at all. Sirius, grin was still getting wider the longer this dragged on, still picturing those three squashed together like that the funniest thing he'd heard in days. I should know. I'm an expert. Remus gave him the stank eye for the joke, like he would have smacked him if he could reach, and Sirius happily stuck his tongue out at him since he couldn't for the time being. James was definitely curious enough to ask, but strung together that a plug must somehow help run the electricity, so he squashed it and filed it away for later. All five of them fell with refreshed laughter, truly unable to stop themselves as they kept imagining how squished that tiny space was getting, and now hoping Ginny, Marley, or Percy hadn't been invited along as well. I can imagine. James' voice quaked with laughter as he got that out. I guess he's going to blast his way out of there. Sirius was still wiping happy tears from his eyes, not at all sorry for laughing at the expense of the poor Weasley boys. He knew for a fact his friends would laugh at him if this exact same circumstances happened to him. Wouldn't I get into trouble for that, though? Harry frowned. Magic's not allowed at my house. They shouldn't say anything to you, since the Ministry knows Arthur's coming to get you, Lily shrugged. There might be an inquiry, but it would be Arthur who explains why he did it, so you're in the clear this time. Course he did. James lit up all the more, and I hope he pays for it. All five of them got one good last laugh as they pictured a clown car like tumble out of that cramped space. Their good mood still lingered enough that they only got a small twist of their lips in displeasure at such a statement, rather than the full-blown rant of hatred each of them felt at such a relation. Good of him to start with some manners, Sirius muttered, humour still gleaming in his eyes as he now wanted to shake Arthur's hand for scaring the Dursleys crapless like that. Guess he should clean that place out more often, Remus smirked. I'm not, James said sincerely. Arthur seems pretty well connected all over. Lily noted, hadn't he also gotten those World Cup tickets from work? She found him a pleasant man, and she'd never even met him. It didn't really surprise her, though, as the longer she thought about it, she supposed several parts of the ministry would have to go talk to the Muggle office for several things. That's their own fault, Sirius scoffed. Maybe if they were decent people, Harry would have explained all of it to them. Still love the term rescue, Remus muttered, sad how fitting the description was. Really, like what? James asked in surprise, as this hadn't ever come up before. Just some of the wilder things he's done, like his tantrums and such. Harry shrugged. I used to compare him and Malfoy a lot back in first year, plus how fat Dudley was. Had a bit of a laugh when I sent Ron that letter that Dudley was on a diet. I suppose he would have showed that to Fred and George. This rather intrigued the others, as Harry kept himself so closed off in any retelling of the Dursleys. It was rare he ever elaborated on whatever the book showed. That it was interesting indeed, he'd clearly shared some of it with at least Ron and his brothers as a laugh. It didn't erase the darker things they wondered about what went on in that house, and Harry's face still clearly showed now he didn't want to talk about it. He proved that by continuing to read as soon as he was done explaining. Lily in particular released a snort for that comment, picturing the dust-coated living room because of Mr. Weasley. Perhaps now hadn't been the best time to mention that, but it was the thought that counted. Something I hope keeps for the rest of their lives, Sirius chuckled. Credit to him for restraining himself. Remus smiled lightly. Arthur was clearly trying his hardest to keep things friendly, though he had no idea that the Dursleys didn't deserve it. Well, to be fair, there are much weirder things I've heard Muggles collect. Lily snickered. She didn't find it that weird at all. Now that could get really interesting really fast, James said almost eagerly. Lily, on the other hand, raised a brow in surprise. While she detested Vernon just as much as her sister, more than she'd hated anyone in her life as a matter of fact, and loathed even giving him one spot of light, it was there when he did the act of attempting to hide his wife. As cruel as he was to her son, Vernon at least showed in that moment that he did hold concern for his own family at least, not that this made up in any way for his cruelty to Harry. A marvelous feat in itself, Sirius grinned. So much credit to him for trying. Remus said again, still half laughing even as he said that. Well, you're just no help at all, Harry, Sirius Mark scolded. You have far more restraint than us, James beamed. Or, Lily couldn't help but coo. Not that Dudley, or any of the Dursleys, deserved Arthur's sympathy, but it was the genuine thought that meant something. I think that translated to no, Sirius quipped. Now why would they do that? Remus asked with interest. They wouldn't mess with Dudley in front of their dad, Lily said without a trace of hope. She really wouldn't put anything past the twins. They reminded her too much of the Marauders. I would give Arthur all the money in the world if he'd curse them, James sighed wistfully, knowing it wasn't going to happen, but what they'd experienced this day being pleasant enough, he'd accept the defeat. "Oh," all three boys sang as one. "I've never seen wizard sweets tested on a Muggle," Lily said with just a hint of curiosity. "Do you think they'd work? I know some won't work on squibs and such." "Well, let's find out," Sirius said eagerly, waving her down. Clearly no one in the room gave even a second to think this had been done by accident. "Sad he didn't get to watch his handiwork play out," James said sincerely. Harry hated to interrupt himself. Somehow he just knew he was about to get to the best part, but still, he couldn't stop himself from asking, how come last time the powder had to be used individually, but this time they're all going with just one blast? "It depends how much is used," Remus happily explained. "The flue will stay activated the more powder is put in. Most people use the smallest amount possible and go one at a time so as not to waste, and let it linger longer than it has to. This time, Mr. Weasley must not have wanted to take the chance of not bringing enough, so he just used more than enough." Harry happily nodded his thanks before continuing. The four of them still had enough kindling annoyance to huff and roll their eyes at this now common display, no matter how much it appeared. Oh, they heard him. Despite James' abundance of agitation at how they treated his son, he couldn't help a hopeful tone as he wondered if, finally, someone else would witness this firsthand. It was such a minor thing in all honesty, but he still crossed his fingers it would be enough that Mr. Weasley would really ask Harry about it. Sirius was so eager to hear the same kind of thing, he was even momentarily distracted from wondering what that sweet would do. Was it possible Arthur would finally step in like Sirius couldn't and say something to these useless muggles? Half surprised he's not cheerfully waving and praising the heavens he'll be gone, Remus grumbled. Every last drop of which is deserved, plus so much more, Lily hissed. If only, all four of them muttered. Yes. The four boys swapped attention at once, practically on the edge of their seat to hear this play out, fully ignoring whatever discomfort this caused their injuries. Harry had not effectively gone through that whole paragraph without having to raise his voice to keep being heard. The others were laughing too hard. Finally, though, he had to stop himself. He couldn't keep going. He was laughing himself at the mental image. Remus was the first to start breathing normally again, rubbing happily at his abused chest and ignoring any lingering pain he had because of it. This had been exactly what the lot of them needed, the Dursleys to get even the smallest dose of payback for what all they'd done to Harry, and for them to get a good laugh in. Harry came back to himself soon enough, and though the others were still chuckling happily, he decided to keep going, noting that there wasn't much left. Yes, I'm so sure that'll help, Lily managed in shaking tones. Nope. James returned. He's the one definitely doing the most good. Good luck with that, Sirius snorted, still not quite in his normal, intelligible voice. He was still half laughing. Lily, on the other hand, felt a stirring towards Petunia for the first time since the first chapter of the first book. Empathy. She'd never forgive Petunia for what she'd done to Harry. But in that one moment, Petunia was acting exactly as her sister had once done to land her nephew in that house. She didn't understand what was happening. She only feared for the safety of her child, and that one action caused Lily to flash back and remember Harry's horrible Dementor memory once again of Lily doing the exact same thing. She was blinking in delayed shock, and realizing that none of them had noticed her change in demeanor, Harry was still reading. James was practically wheezing beside his wife. He was trying so hard to stop himself, laughing hard enough Harry would stop again, the task becoming more difficult the longer this dragged on. Can't deny I'd like to see this, Remus muttered. Now, really? Lily raised a brow in surprise. What good would throwing plates around do? He's panicking, Harry said with a shrug, still smiling broadly with every word. They wouldn't care one little bit if you were helping or trying to burn your house down. They would be acting the exact same way, Sirius scoffed, hoping the situation could still somehow get worse. What no? James all but begged. Harry more than anyone deserves to see this play out. Lily couldn't help but wonder if Vernon was actually aiming for Harry, so at this point she couldn't help but agree with Arthur. She'd rather like her son to get out of there, or things really could get worse. I want to capture that moment forever, Sirius sighed, actually closing his eyes and mentally etching that into his memory, determined to think on that instead of something worse next time those useless muggles came to mind. Chapter's done. Harry happily cheered as he stood and went to give the book to Remus. I think I'm honestly disappointed, Remus pouted as he juggled the baby and the book before Harry took pity on him and took the infant. That was the best chapter yet, and by our track record that means we've probably got 3 bad chapters in a row coming up now. Oh, cheer up, Remus. James tried to put that emotion into his own tone. Harry's going to the Weasleys. He's going to the World Cup. I doubt anything bad can happen there. Chapter 5. Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. Chapter text. The moment Harry sat back down, he passed the baby along to Sirius, while Remus got started with a genuine smile still in place, and sadly having to hope it would last. Let's just hope you end up in the right grate this time, Lily muttered to herself. Still sore she even had to think back on a time this had happened. Couldn't her boy ever go through one thing normally? Have I mentioned how much I love those twins? Sirius demanded with the widest of smirks still in place, because I don't think I mention it enough. Couldn't be prouder, James agreed with a serious nod. Invented them, Remus repeated, double-checking he'd read that right. You mean the twins have actually started creating their own products to prank people? Sirius demanded, looking faint from happiness. That's brilliant, James breathed, his eyes lighting with more new possibilities he'd never even thought of. What's more is, they clearly work. Can you imagine if they keep going with this? They put Zonkos out of business in a heartbeat, Remus agreed at once. Harry was watching all of them with a very happy, settling feeling indeed, surprised that for once his first instinct was to agree with them, and he was actually happy for it. He had quite a lot of faith indeed that Fred and George were only just getting started. Lily only let the boys prattle on with a few more hopes and groans they wished they'd come up with this themselves, before she inserted, "All right, you lot, enough. We'll be here all day if you keep this up." James still had his arm happily around her as he teased, "You just don't want to admit you like the idea." She grinned right back as she said, "I'll readily admit it's an interesting idea. From what we've heard, they've certainly got the skill and ideas, but I want to see how far they think they'll take it." After all, there was a difference between concocting fake sweets in your free time and handing them out as pranks, and going full-blown like these boys were thinking and possibly over-exaggerating. She flicked her fingers at Remus for him to keep going, which he happily obliged. What with their brother's knowledge of said twins, those two were probably lacking in the guinea pig department, Remus snickered. Oh, cool. Sirius somehow still managed to get even more excited. He'd been really wanting to meet at least Charlie, find out what kind of insanity that one must house to be working with dragons of his own free will. I guess I can see why you'd think that, James gave a slight pout. After all, you'd yet to meet a fun prefect or head boy as far as you knew. But this sounds like it's about to get interesting, Sirius chirped, having noted that surprising part most of all. There's the older brother I always wanted, James chuckled. Now that hurt, Sirius Mark pouted this time. You've got me, haven't you? Sirius, James groaned in a long, suffering voice. You are 145 days older than me, let it go. I doubt he ever will, Remus muttered, knowing full well Sirius had to keep something over their heads, and though he rarely acted it, being the oldest was one he loved. Lily was just happy to see her boys joking around again at all. He'd been so worried after the travesty of the last book that they'd truly lost a part of themselves. But if they decided to keep themselves going with old jokes she'd heard 1,000 times, she'd take it in a heartbeat. Harry couldn't help but give a startled little blink. He'd heard of apparition, of course. He could even do it himself if he didn't think about it, but the idea still gave his 14-year-old mind a bit of a spin. What stopped him from appearing right where George was and hurting them both? Was there a distance limit? He was positive he learned all of those answers in another time, though, so for now he decided not to pester the others with them. It's sad that he didn't appreciate that as much as we did, Remus sighed. He didn't have all the backstory, Sirius snorted, giving Harry a sideways look as he continued. I'm sure if Harry would tell him and Marley what all's been going on in that house, Arthur would have done the opposite of stopping his sons. Harry just gave him a half-blank, half-curious look, which none of them bought for a second. The details make it, James praised, nearly bouncing in his seat all over again, forcing this happy feeling to linger as he thought back on all the times he'd done this to McGonagall or any number of teachers, still forcefully ignoring one certain person who would often be in there with him. Now was not the time to ask that, Remus couldn't help but correct with an indulgent smile. Really, there isn't a good time, Sirius shrugged. May as well get it in now, see if they could find out from him by surprise, causing all 5 of them to burst out laughing again. Oh, but it is, James disagreed, eagerness still his dominant feature as he looked like he still wanted to go watch all of that in person all over again. You're just not in on the full joke. Bill and Charlie might not even be, and they're clearly laughing along, Lily giggled. Ouch, Lily winced. Okay, yeah, I can understand where you get that from, Remus frowned. It's not like Arthur knows better, James sighed. Well, to be fair, I can see the twins pulling this on anyone, not just a muggle who deserved it. Sirius offered, not that Arthur knows he deserves it, he amended with a mutter at the end. Then what was the point? James couldn't help but ask with a small smile. That they did it, and they shouldn't have, Lily shrugged, still seeing the parents' side of it better than the boys' it seemed, which gave all of them a collective snort of amusement. Clearly Arthur wasn't that mad then, but was just telling the boys off, while probably holding back some laughter with this response. Marley, on the other hand, from what they'd seen of her, would probably do a lot worse than just shouting at them. The Dursleys deserved it. That wasn't being questioned in this room. But how much the 2 Weasley parents understood this, they had no clue, and Harry probably wasn't going to enlighten them. Harry couldn't help but give a soft smile, still looking back and finding that crush adorable, though he wasn't sure of why. He hoped Ginny grew out of this shyness phase soon. He'd really like to remember he talked to her at some point. I get the feeling they've all heard the tone at one point or another, Sirius muttered. Lily uttered softly to herself, a slight smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. She didn't really think what Arthur had yelled at them was really akin to had words with them, more a mild telling off that probably didn't even faze the trouble-making twins. But as she didn't really think Fred and George deserved a telling off for what they'd done, she wasn't going to argue the point either. Now what's this? Remus perked up, his mind automatically flashing back to their earlier discussion. Sound like the name of a store to anyone else. James yelped eagerly. Sirius was practically wiggling around in pleasure. From what he'd heard about these twins, he figured they'd be brilliant if they really set their mind to that sort of thing. Subtle, Lily snickered. And Ron still has no clue, Sirius cackled. I think it's a good idea the lot of them go, Remus agreed, not even bothering to hide his smile. Please don't tell me Hermione got that stick back up her butt, James pouted. I think this sounds like a brilliant idea. Because she didn't laugh doesn't mean she doesn't approve, Lily reproached, while giving a slight frown as well. She didn't see why Hermione would dislike the idea. Oh, Merlin they are, Sirius crowed, bouncing the baby around so much he was giggling up a storm, still managing to make the lot of them laugh even harder. Not one of them could come up with a reason why this wasn't a brilliant idea. Perfectly understandable, Remus nodded, his eyes still alight with all the possibilities this could lead to. Dangerous, Lily frowned in confusion. How so? Whatever they used on Dudley seemed to work fine, and if Arthur figured out how to fix it without even fully understanding what they'd done, I doubt it's that bad. They all remained silent, not really having an answer, until Sirius heard that. Then he offered, maybe because not all of it's tested. He gave a careless shrug like he wasn't sure that this should still be classified. But they need to find guinea pigs somewhere, so they're choosing Hogwarts. Not a bad idea, since Madame Pomfrey could fix anything major. Lily chose to roll her eyes at him, but agreed with his logic nonetheless. Harsh, Remus winced, thinking that she could have taken them away until they were more proofed or something. Lily couldn't help a little sigh of pity for the twins. She of course understood the want of a mother to see her kids do well in school, but going from previous experiences, she had the feeling Molly was expecting Percy-like results from those two, and that wasn't exactly fair of her. I still don't understand those random inserts, James muttered. We know. Remus just ignored him. Molly's starting to depress me, Sirius pouted. Have we seen any indication that those two could cope behind a desk? I can see her point, Lily sighed. She thinks that would be better for them, and what they're wanting is really expensive and risky if it doesn't work. But I do wish she'd give them a shot at it. Yes, well, hopefully she'll calm down and see reason when they blow up a school corridor or something, Remus muttered, hoping that the 1000th time those two got into trouble would make her see they had a knack for it. You live in a house of how many people? James shot back with a raised brow. I hardly think it would ever be quiet there. I am positive you've been living with that your whole life, Sirius muttered, and you've learned to get over it before. All three boys groaned, not even remotely curious to hear about this, but Lily gave her son an appreciative smile, always loving how her son tried to keep up with Percy, even when his siblings discouraged otherwise. Does he have to be so pompous about everything? James muttered, noting that was 90% of his description, which at least gave the three marauders a good laugh. Oh, don't go dragging me into this conversation, Sirius groaned, his proud smirk saying otherwise at any opportunity to use that joke, even if Harry was the only one that laughed along. Lily couldn't help a little sigh of pity for Percy now. She completely understood the importance of what Percy was doing, and it was good to take your work seriously. But the fact that all four boys' eyes were glazing over as this conversation continued probably wasn't boding well for Percy's siblings on the stairwell either. It must be difficult for the poor thing not to have anyone to talk to about this, which didn't help anyone's mood, as the more they heard about this, the more they'd like to defend Fred and George for every shot Molly would take at them. Here they'd thought coming to the burrow would make them feel better. Oh well, at least this was still better than hearing about the Dursleys. Bet if he didn't have that owl, he'd take that as his pet, James said with forced cheerfulness, who knew talking about Ron's pets would ever cause him a sore spot. Then he'd really have to take back that comment he made about Trevor first year. Even getting out that fake name for the rat came with a cold bite to Remus' tone, but he kept going forcefully so that no one had to linger on it long. Well, Ron's owl is officially named Pig, Lily said, with a touch too much chipper, like the others shaking off any mention of that old rat. Can't wait to hear the explanation for that. James let out a surprised whistle as he tried to imagine that. Ron's room had sounded cramped before. Lily couldn't help but purse her lips as she once again saw both sides to that coin. The other two boys were on holiday, but Percy wasn't, so he would need his workspace. But that didn't mean he shouldn't have to put up with at least one of his brothers. It could have been spaced out a little more evenly. It did bring up the interesting question of how room assignments had gone before the oldest two had moved out, who had shared rooms then. She didn't bring it up, though, as she didn't really find it her place to criticize the Weasleys as to where they had their kids sleep. Ah, yes, because that makes much more sense, Sirius snorted in delight. I guess Pig isn't a bad second then, Remus agreed with a light chuckle. I really want to know if there's a backstory to that name as well, James smirked. I wasn't really aware owls answered to anything, Harry said in surprise. It's not as if they come when they're called. If Hedwig's not on her perch, I can't tell her to come. I think Ron just didn't change it because he's being nice to Ginny, Lily shrugged. That name is a mouthful, though, so he just shortens it to Pig. I am just so glad Ron liked his present. Sirius beamed, looking all the more pleased the owl he'd chosen was getting the added bonus of randomly agitating Ron, something he'd do to any of his friends in a heartbeat, just for a good laugh. Did Marley and Arthur say anything? Remus asked, thinking he'd certainly question a kid who came home with a pet they hadn't left with. They asked where he got it from. Harry nodded in agreement, and Ron said a friend got tired of owning him, so passed him on to Ron. Well, that's good, because I'm serious. Sirius happily shot in as well, while Harry snickered, and Remus still stoutly ignored him. Remus now regretted not having let Sirius bask in his joke at least a few moments longer, because his face switched back to narrow-eyed hate in seconds. But again, Remus chose not to pause as it wouldn't do anyone any good. If only, James hissed under his breath. That's a bit intense. James frowned thoughtfully at the description. Is Percy really acting that bad? Picture how he was described acting about his schoolwork, prefect, and head boy duties, and double it, Harry sighed, going more on instinct than actual memory for that answer. But from the few moments he'd had of Percy's work life, he was positive he wasn't wrong, and somehow still knew it would only get worse. Crouch, Lily repeated in surprise. He's the head of magical cooperation. Sirius also couldn't help a shocked tone as well. Harry was frowning at the mention of this name. It held some significance to him he couldn't place, so he asked, "How do you guys know him?" "He's slated to be the next minister," James shrugged. "He's the most anti-Death Eater on the Wisengamot right now, been fighting fire with fire, if you will." Harry's frown only managed to deepen, as this only managed to raise more questions, like what a Death Eater was. Then he got a sinking feeling deep inside saying he didn't want to know that answer for as long as possible, so didn't press the point. "I think the guy's a bit of a nut," Remus snorted. "Getting a bit too intense with his job, really, but no one's denying he's getting results either." Harry vaguely remembered them mentioning something about this back during his first-year talk with Hagrid when Fudge had been mentioned as the minister, and he had an inkling that this may connect to his own feelings towards the name, but they were all vague, and he had no way to string them together, so he just nodded his content as Lily added, "Guess when Fudge got the job, Crouch got shunted elsewhere. I'm sure he's bitter about it." The boys shrugged, but mostly with disinterest now. The surprise had worn off, and they didn't really care about him one way or the other. It was just interesting that this was how it had played out. They wouldn't deny they'd like to hear the reason Crouch didn't get the position of minister, but it wasn't a top priority to them either, which gave Harry a good laugh at least, much like he had when Ron had said this the first time. "Probably literally," Lily sniffed with distaste, hoping Marley would serve dinner soon. "Or I think Ron was about to ask about me." Sirius gave a slight smile. "Good that he didn't get it out, though," Lily sighed. "Hadn't you said Ginny was up there?" "Yep," Harry nodded, smiling as well as he knew his friends were just as worried about his godfather as he'd been. Remus once again felt a swift kick in the gut that he hadn't been mentioned, which somehow kept hurting more rather than less as this carried on. And sadly, his reading, it seemed to have made the others realize this, as well as he felt more than just lingering eyes on him as he read that. But he didn't acknowledge them, and instead kept going loudly. "Well, she does know we get into some interesting stuff at school," Harry offered, doing the same thing now as his dad looked about ready to say something to Remus. It was probably better Hermione didn't give her the chance to ask. Sirius threw Harry a curious look as well, looking between him and Remus with a calculating look, but no one said anything else, and Remus didn't look likely to give them the chance. Least they got to avoid that fight, Lily muttered, now watching the boys expectantly like she expected a fight to crop up now. I can see why you love her cooking so much. Sirius gave a soft laugh. I consider that plenty of ambition, Remus said sagely, happy to see Sirius and James smirk along, so at least he seemed to have convinced them to silently let the matter go for now. Where's that coming from? Harry asked in surprise. She probably has it stored somewhere. Perhaps they have a cellar or something, and she's summoning it from there, Lily shrugged. A genuine accomplishment, Sirius said brightly. That shouldn't be a real issue until they come of age, James shrugged. After all, he'd never heard those two get up to anything as bad as that, causing all five of them to release surprised snorts of laughter. Another Fred and George invention, most likely, and yet another fairly clever idea. The more they heard, the more confident they all were they'd be amazing at a joke shop. A fair idea, Lily sighed. She's probably going to be that way until she gets it all out of her system, and you don't need that directed at someone who doesn't deserve it, she finished with a maternal eye on her son. James gave a burst of laughter, recognizing it as a gnome of course, but the description was too priceless to pass up. Remus blinked in surprise as he read that, wondering what they were out there breaking now, causing all five of them to crack up laughing all over again. It seemed they'd found a clear indication of where Fred and George had found their role models. Ron's eldest two brothers seemed to find more than enough trouble with this small and brilliant display. Who knew what had started the fight? But fighting tables like that was brilliant. Marley was clearly over-exaggerating that Bill and Charlie never caused trouble if this was what they were doing with their free time. Oh, come on, Hermione, Sirius groaned, not able to get to a full pout because he was still chuckling. Laugh at least a little, come on, at least tell me she was giggling, that's hilarious. Harry was too busy laughing himself to answer. Killjoy, Remus pouted. Surprised he'd call them out like that. James rolled his eyes. They can't be that distracting. I think he just likes yelling at people, Sirius said innocently. Liking them more and more, James said affectionately, already smiling at finally having an idea of all of the Weasleys after just one chapter, rather than his growing agitation at Percy, who he'd heard about for 3 books now. I can imagine, Lily nodded seriously, finally letting go of the lingering tension the Dursleys caused her, as she now knew her boy was going to be properly taken care of. Harry, Sirius groaned pitifully, eyeing Lily hopefully to get his point across. Yes, all right, she smiled back. I'll scrounge up something for lunch after this. Not this again, Remus sighed. 3 times in one chapter, I didn't want to hear about this the first time. Harry, stop listening in on him already, Sirius pouted. I'll try, Harry shot back with an eye roll. It's not like he could go back and plug his ears from this. Harry was really tempted to ask what that department would, or in this case wouldn't, be doing to help, but the boys already looked so bored from Percy's talking he decided he wouldn't bother them more. The beater for the Wimborne Wasps, Sirius practically shouted in excitement, startling the baby in his arms. You mean to tell me he's now head of the Department for Magical Games and Sports? It's not that surprising, Lily shrugged. That field is often run by retired Quidditch players. We're just learning all kinds of things today, James shrugged, some interest gleaming in his eyes as well, telling Harry that maybe he could have gotten away with his question, but then Remus kept going, and he decided it wasn't worth it. Arthur is friends with a beater from the Wimborne Wasps, Sirius practically drooled, all but wriggling in place all over again. Can you imagine? That means he must be able to get tickets to practically any game he wants. And he got 11 of them to the cup. Breathe, Sirius, Remus reminded. It hasn't happened yet. Don't go hounding on him for another few years. Sirius didn't deflate by much. He did consider it a good thing these things hadn't happened, yet otherwise he'd probably be in Azkaban. But it was nice to finally hear something about the future that was encouraging. Would actually really love to hear the story behind that, Lily said mildly. They all felt an odd prickling at the base of their neck at this throwaway line. People disappeared. It was a sad fact of life, but they couldn't help but flash back to Harry's odd dream of Voldemort claiming to have murdered someone. They were obviously just being paranoid, though. It most likely wasn't connected. Well, there went that hope. One glance at Harry showed him frowning in agitation at that name all over again, which meant none of them could even pretend that they were overthinking this. Wait, Remus frowned, thinking aloud now. Bertha's working for magical games and sports. How on earth does that help Voldemort in any way? I still want to know why she had a memory charm placed on her that helped so much, Lily sighed. She doesn't exactly work in a secretive department. Harry gave a funny little twitch that only Sirius noticed, and he frowned in confusion and concern at him. But when Harry clearly was trying to repress any further reactions from their questions, Sirius instead offered, "Well, I'm still hoping that we don't find any of this out, because I'd rather not hear about Harry finding this out. Still feel bad for the poor thing, but can we move this along?" Remus gave Sirius a look of mild surprise, unclear why Sirius was acting so concerned about the topic, but heeded it and kept reading. Albania, Harry couldn't help but mentally repeat to himself in confusion. Something about there tickled something in his memory, but it was so tiny he wasn't even sure he had a real feeling about it. Just another missing piece to this ever-growing puzzle. It was somehow even more sad to hear about this, knowing that she would never be found. A terrible ache returning the longer this dragged on, because the person who did lead her to her death was someone they'd all like to see hung sometime soon. It was somehow worse that James may have laughed and agreed with that before he knew she was dead. But now that he did know, he wanted to smack Percy for speaking ill of her. That wasn't fair, of course. Percy didn't know better. It just wasn't getting better to keep hearing about this. Wonder why, Lily said in mild confusion, as she sounded a bit like a bother to a professional like Crouch. Harry felt bile beginning to pile up on his tongue. There it was right there. Something genuinely important he should remember at this insert. But whatever it was building up was gone the moment Remus kept going after he agreed with Lily at how odd it was. "Oh yeah," Sirius muttered with disinterest, fidgeting with baby Harry's fingers to keep himself distracted. "Please don't tell me he's going to start going on about some world assembly I also don't care about." James gave a forced snort, happy to be able to rag on Percy again for clearly trying to overshoot something that probably was about as important as his cauldron bottom report. "So glad Ron agrees." Remus gave a forced snicker, right in line with James on that one. "Where did you get it?" Sirius asked innocently, finally kicking the tension out of the room again with another laugh, as Ginny had a really good point on that one. A proper conversation that, James nodded seriously, wishing Harry had just been listening in on this the whole time. "Youch!" Sirius winced horribly, still not wiping the smile off his face at such a light-hearted conversation topic he hoped would never end. "One of your proudest school achievements," James nodded with a proud smirk, still not regretting it when Lily gave him a light swat for that. "One of," Sirius reproved with a challenging brow at him. "The best," Harry happily corrected himself. "These books can repeat that as often as they like," Remus chuckled happily as he flipped the page, always enjoying watching his friends light up at that reminder, no matter how often it was mentioned or what consequences came of the game. "Can't really blame you," Lily shrugged. "Most of the reason you didn't want to write to Ron was because you didn't want his whole family knowing about it. If you start telling them now, they definitely hear." Ouch! Remus winced at such a terrible time, but as this was involving the World Cup, James and Sirius didn't even flinch and just grinned more broadly. James was practically bouncing in his seat again, so much so that Lily decided to kick him off the couch again so that he could go annoy her son and Sirius, as she knew this was only going to get worse as they got closer to the game. James gave her a slight pout, claiming that she should love him enough to put up with all of his quirks, but didn't pursue the point as he gave her a quick kiss and flopped down on Harry's other side, still bouncing like a loon and causing Harry to laugh like crazy. "You don't have to stay the whole time," Remus rolled his eyes. "Here's hoping he doesn't," Sirius agreed with a scoff, not understanding how anyone could wish Quidditch would end sooner. Lily raised a brow in surprise, wondering what that was about. "Okay," James said with a slight smirk, drawing the word out a bit as he imagined how that had come up, causing all of the boys to crack up laughing merrily one last time. "Have I mentioned how much I love those twins?" Sirius said a little breathily. "I don't think I quite mentioned that enough." "Chapter's over," Remus said as he got up to hand the book to Lily, and then plopped down beside her since he felt bad she was sitting by herself. She took the book, but gave him a wary eye, not entirely sure he'd restrain himself any better than the other boys when it came to the Quidditch game, but not going to protest the company for now. Chapter 6. The Portkey. Chapter text. Lily excused herself before she started the next chapter, scrounging up a quick lunch for the boys, and Harry happily followed, leaving the other three in a rather awkward silence. They hadn't really had a chance to talk since the end of the last book, but now that Remus himself had read out that he clearly wasn't having anything to do with Harry, James and Sirius weren't even sure what they could say to Remus. Clearly something had happened to him after James' death, something that made him believe Sirius had done all of those terrible things and not go to check up on Harry, and he'd never given a reason why to Harry. They weren't even writing to each other. For all they knew, he wasn't even out there helping Sirius either. It bothered them greatly, but considering what that rat was destined to do to them, it wasn't the highest of treason he could pull either, no matter how much it hurt, so neither of them were going to acknowledge it for as long as they could. Which is why it surprised them all the more when Remus whispered, "I'm sorry." Sirius snorted, with surprising ease brushing that off as he told him, "For what?" Ignoring Harry. "You haven't done it yet, so don't apologize until you have. You should be partially glad you are, otherwise James would be getting jealous of you two." James threw him a sharp look, opened his mouth, but then turned away with a wince of shame. Had he been that obvious? Sirius nodded, though, like James had agreed with him anyways. "Our future is a mess, but there's no sense in apologizing to each other until we can't fix it anymore." Remus studied him for a few moments longer before he fully grinned at him, not a trace of sarcasm present as he demanded, "When did you get so wise?" "Because I know there's someone else I'm never going to forgive," Sirius said back in such a low voice it no longer really sounded like him. "Trust me, Remus, whatever you do or don't do, it won't get that bad." Remus and James' face twitched, like their insides had just been slammed against their skeletal systems unexpectedly, but thankfully Lily and Harry returned then. Once they'd all eaten their fill, Lily quickly retook her spot. She found her place and began reading with genuine interest, very curious, and more than happy to be reading about her son going to something as innocent and fun as the World Cup, even if Quidditch wasn't her idea of a good time. It was still better than, say, running into Fluffy again. Lily made the appropriately disgusted face at being awoken before the sun, but the boys looked far too giddy for what was to come to care. "And you said you weren't sure if Arthur knew how to dress like a muggle," Remus chuckled. "I'm guessing that's good then." James shrugged with disinterest, more curious as to why he had to dress like that at all. Where were they going that involved muggles seeing them? "I'm guessing because they don't know how," Sirius snorted. "They're only just now going into their 6th year after all. They won't even get the practices until then." "I'm guessing that hasn't stopped them from trying, though," Remus smirked. Harry watched the others around him give a little face twitch of sympathy, but as frustrating as always, he was truly lost what that word meant. But since he knew Arthur was fixing to explain, he chose not to ask now. Harry went bug-eyed in shock, now gaping at all of his limbs as he thought back to his most recent apparition, and how he'd managed to do it with only a gut feeling on how. He felt fortunate to have come out of it unscathed now. Harry continued to crinkle up his nose, all the more as he pictured that, making the others give half-hearted smiles at his expression, grateful themselves he hadn't been hurt by the experience, because they wouldn't have been able to help. Yet Harry blinked spastically for a completely different reason at the mention of the eyeball. Something about a singular eye and his 4th year. The memory fell through the moment he tried to grasp it, causing the others to do a little snicker of appreciation, making Lily feel a little better as she'd had to take the test 3 times. When Harry was looking at them expectantly, clearly hoping they'd share some funny story as well, she sighed, swallowed her pride, and went ahead and admitted, "Charlie's lucky. It took me till my 3rd try to pass." James had to keep his expression very carefully neutral. He'd paid dearly the last few times he'd laughed at Lily for this. "The first time, I did splinch myself, and they obviously won't let you pass for that. The second time I somehow wound up 5 feet in the air and crash-landed, sprained my wrist, and also didn't pass. Apparition is not my friend." she finished with a little huff, finishing with a glare at her husband, who was shaking with repressed laughter by the end. Her then-boyfriend had taken the mickey out of her for ages both times, after being appropriately concerned that she was all right of course, but never could seem to resist the expression he held now whenever this came up. It didn't help he'd done it perfectly his first try. It took me till my second try as well, Remus shrugged. I apparated into the middle of some bar, made some blocks piss themselves in shock. That wasn't very fun for the ministry to fix. Can you apparate with animals? Sirius inserted with interest. The idea had never occurred to him, but now that he knew he was taking care of Buckbeak, he wondered if he was making the hippogriff do all the transportation. Then again, when he'd left, he was 99% sure he hadn't a wand, and he doubted he'd pop into Ollivander's to get one, so maybe he was being too enthusiastic. I wouldn't recommend it. Lily frowned in sympathy at him, as they all guessed where his mind had jumped to. They get too easily startled. I'm positive they could get splinched as well. In fact, it would be more likely of the animal, and then you'd have a real mess on your hands. Sirius realized he'd successfully brought the mood back down to a pitying level on himself, and as he in no way wanted that, he instead forced a chipper smile back onto his face and declared, "Well, fine then, Miss Know-it-all, I won't try it. Why don't you get back to reading now? I know you're just stalling for the cup." Lily gave him a look that said quite clearly she knew what he was doing, but didn't argue the point either. "As if he won't be doing the same," James remarked. Lily managed to pull that tone a little too well, making all four boys jump, as well like she'd shot that at them, though she kept reading with a smug smile in place. They frowned now, feeling sorrow at once for the twins. Of course it wasn't their right to interfere with how Mrs. Weasley dealt with her kids, but they still felt it wasn't fair either for her to be treating them like this. All of them agreed there were certainly far worse things they could be doing with their time than trying to invent joke items to make people laugh. Lily kept herself going, though, knowing there was nothing they could do about it. "Why?" Harry asked with some interest, feeling like he should know the answer anyways, but now hoping just to distract them just a bit. "We're probably going to sell them at the Cup or something," Remus sighed. "Inventive," Sirius sighed in pity for the two. Mrs. Weasley wasn't nearly as bad as his mother, but he had a good idea how the twins were feeling towards their own right then, and it wasn't good. "Only toss them in the bin." James raised a brow in surprise. "She must know they'll just dig them out later." "Only 6 months," Lily rebutted in surprise. "Those are pretty inventive. I'm genuinely surprised that's only how long it took them." "Ouch," all 5 of them muttered, wishing she wouldn't keep harping on that. Harry couldn't help a little creeping feeling up his spine, wondering why that felt ominous to him. Something to do with the World Cup, something that happened there that would upset Mrs. Weasley about this. Then he sneezed, losing all trace of the thought. "Wouldn't say they're not doing that as well," James nodded enthusiastically. "As Arthur said, apparating and portkeys aren't the only way to travel, and flying's just more fun." "What are portkeys?" Harry asked in surprise. "An object that you can charm to take you anywhere at a set time," Sirius explained. "Like apparating through using an object. It's much safer, though, used for large families because you don't have to concentrate on anything. You just touch it, and it drags you along." "That's where you're headed now," James added on. "At least, it makes the most sense why you'd have to be there at a specific time and all this." "That would be a sight," Remus snickered at all of that offered mayhem. Lily whistled in surprise, imagining missing that much work for this game, but it would come with a bit of a camping trip along as well, so it was probably worth the fun. "Plus, we stick out like a sore thumb," Sirius smirked over at James, who definitely was ignoring him now. They all noticed that Harry hadn't asked them that, but he was getting so much better about interrupting them when he did have a question, they decided to let that one go. Lily couldn't resist the charm in her voice as she read that. Despite begrudging the early rise, she'd never moan about it in person if she got to see that beautiful sunrise on top of a hill which Harry was fixing to witness. "Dang, and you lot are all in shape," Remus said in surprise. "Imagine someone elderly or some little kids trying to make that trek. I'm sure someone could help magic them up," James shrugged. "Arthur just didn't because he didn't have a need to." Remus couldn't help but stiffen a little in unease. Stupidly, yes, but he'd always had an instinctual fear of that department. Lily noticed, and though she felt a wash of sympathy for him, she didn't break to say anything, knowing it would only embarrass him. Wasn't that the Hufflepuff from last year? Sirius asked with his head cocked to the side. Harry felt an odd stirring in the pit of his stomach, unable to stop a frown as he heard that name again. He'd felt something the first time as well, the ghost of a feeling he knew he should have at the name, but it was so hard to hold on to. The most dominant thing was his 14-year-old agitation that this bloke had beaten him out at Quidditch, rightly, and had even tried to correct himself when he found out how. But he was the reason Harry lost his first match nonetheless. There was something else there, though, something he desperately knew he needed to remember about Cedric. But all he was getting for his trouble was a terrible mounting headache, one he knew would only get worse if he pressed on this. He had to blink a few times to realize the others had been watching him with a touch of concern, and he tried for an easy smile as he said, "Just trying to not remember something. There's something about Cedric, this year in particular, I don't know what," he finished with a helpless shrug, unable to elaborate. "You probably face him in Quidditch again or something," James happily offered. "Maybe you're trying to remember that you beat the dickens out of him this round," Remus smirked. Harry gave him an unenthusiastic smile back, knowing quite well that wasn't it, but at a loss for what it could be. Lily kept frowning at her son for a moment longer. She didn't even recognize that expression her son held while he tried to remember this, but it gave her a foreboding feeling. Knowing there was nothing for it, though, but to let it come back naturally, she decided to keep reading. Extremely handsome, eh? Sirius couldn't help but tease, still looking for a way to get rid of that look on Harry's face the boy didn't even seem to realize he was holding. "Maybe we were wrong in saying you fancy Hermione." Harry rolled his eyes good-naturedly at the teasing, but still seemed too distracted to really say anything back, leaving them all just that little bit more uneasy. "And rightly so," James nodded seriously, having held on to a few grudges as well of perfectly friendly people who had the gall to beat him as well. Lily wanted to smack him, knowing he was mostly kidding, but not wanting Harry to get the idea otherwise. One glance at him, though, showed he was still only half listening at best. "That doesn't drop the count by much," Lily muttered. "No, Harry Houdini," Remus grumbled, his along with everyone else's eyes narrowing with distaste at Harry's fame being brought up like that again, most annoyingly by an adult who should know a little better. Harry was plenty distracted now, finally snapping himself away from whatever reason Cedric's name was bothering him, to begin blushing and looking embarrassed all over again at the mention of his full name like that. That was his takeaway. James scowled. That his son tried to call a redo when he found out. "Guess we're lucky Cedric hasn't turned into a Malfoy," Sirius muttered with distaste. So what if that was a bit harsh? His comment had stung. "Do I somehow get the feeling they've had this conversation before?" Remus sighed with pity. "Least Cedric isn't acting like that." Lily nodded in agreement. All four of them were starting to get more than agitated now, not at all appreciating the reminder of what had made Harry fall off his broom. Let's see Cedric hear the echo of his dead mother and see how well he hangs on. None of them could bring themselves to shout that, though, as it wasn't Cedric saying this, but his father who was simply acting like a pompous but proud father. They just hoped that stupid portkey would be activating soon. "Least he's being perceptive," Lily grumbled. Harry started blinking spastically. There it was all over again, a name he was sure he recognized. At least this time he was positive of the feeling it caused him, a nice warmth that meant he was sure he liked whoever that name was attached to. He didn't linger on it, though, as he'd had enough of a headache this chapter from Cedric and his dad. Lily and Remus at least couldn't help light snickering at this description Harry was painting, while James and Sirius didn't get it. They'd grown up so that this wasn't even close to odd to them, but sometimes, for Lily and Remus at least, the magical and blasé way wizards did, or didn't realize, something was off still amused them. Harry couldn't help going a little round-eyed in shock, placing his hand carefully on his stomach to remind himself that feeling washing back over him was not happening to him now, causing both boys on either side of him to start laughing this time. Harry had been feeling a little abashed at once hearing that Cedric had clearly stayed on his feet, but then it melted away at once, as clearly he wasn't the only one put off by this mode of travel. James still noticed the expression and gave him a small nudge, muttering, "Don't worry, Remus still falls down more than half the time with those two. They are not a comfortable ride to get used to." Harry gave him a grateful smile at once. That's the end of the chapter, Lily shrugged, giving the book a toss to James. Man, these are short, James noted. Yeah, all the more build-up, Sirius reminded eagerly, already rubbing his hands together in anticipation, knowing that cup wasn't going to come fast enough.